In the snowbound Havford Manor, a lavish Christmas gathering turns deadly when Lady Beatrice plummets down a grand staircase, her fall declared an accident. But Miss Jane Marple, with her sharp eyes and quiet knitting, sees through the facade. A snagged gown, a mysterious scratch, a hidden sedative, and a will set to ruin a desperate husband unravel a chilling truth. As the snow traps the guilty, Miss Marple weaves a web of clues, exposing a murder born of greed in this gripping tale of deception and justice. Chapter 1. The Snowbound Manor. The snow descended in relentless waves over St. Mary's Mead, cloaking the village in a hush that seemed to muffle even the thoughts of its inhabitants. Miss Jane Marple sat in her neat parlour, her knitting needles moving with the quiet rhythm of a metronome, their soft clicks blending with the crackle of the fire. Beyond her window, the world was a blur of white, the hedgerows and cottages reduced to ghostly outlines. She paused, her mild blue eyes scanning the scene, not with idle curiosity, but with the keen observation of one who understood that the smallest details often held the greatest truths. On her lap lay an invitation, its crisp paper slightly creased. From her thoughtful handling, it was from Havford Manor, the imposing estate of Sir Reginald and Lady Beatrice Thornton, requesting her presence at a Christmas gathering. The handwriting was Sir Reginald's bold, with a flourish that spoke of confidence, but the phrasing struck Miss Marple as oddly formal, as though it masked some unspoken urgency. She had met the Thorntons only twice, at village functions, yet she recalled Sir Reginald's hearty laugh and Lady Beatrice's delicate poise, her smile tinged with something indefinable, a shadow, perhaps, of unease. Miss Marple folded the invitation and rose, her movements precise despite her age. She packed a modest suitcase, 2 woolen dresses, her best shawl and a skein of yarn for the inevitable quiet moments. As she did, her mind sifted through what she knew of the Thorntons. Sir Reginald, a retired financier, was a man of considerable wealth, though rumours whispered of reckless investments. Lady Beatrice, some 20 years his junior, was the daughter of a shipping magnate, her inheritance a topic of discreet village gossip. Why, Miss Marple wondered, had they invited her, a spinster of no particular social standing? The question lingered like a loose thread, begging to be pulled. The journey to Havford Manor was arduous, the snow-laden roads forcing the hired car to crawl. When the manor came into view, it was a spectacle of grandeur, its stone facade softened by the blizzard, its many windows glowing with the promise of warmth. Holly wreaths adorned the doors, and the faint strains of a carol drifted from within. Miss Marple stepped into the entrance hall, where a towering Christmas tree sparkled with tinsel and glass baubles. The air smelled of pine and spiced wine. Yet she sensed a faint discord beneath the festive veneer. Sir Reginald greeted her with a booming voice, his ruddy face creased in a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "Miss Marple, delighted you could brave the storm," he exclaimed, taking her coat. Lady Beatrice, at his side, offered a delicate hand, her crimson lips curving in welcome. She was strikingly beautiful, her dark hair swept up in an elegant chignon, but her eyes darted nervously, as though seeking something beyond the room. Miss Marple murmured her thanks, noting the slight tremor in Beatrice's fingers. The other guests were already assembled in the drawing-room, a vast space adorned with velvet drapes and portraits of stern Thornton ancestors. Dr. Ernest Haydock, the village physician, stood by the fire, his wiry frame and sharp features softened by a glass of sherry. Clara Winthrop, a widow with a penchant for gossip, perched on a settee, her eyes gleaming as she surveyed the company. Leonard Price, Sir Reginald's business associate, leaned against a bookcase, his polished demeanour at odds with the restless tapping of his foot. Lastly, there was Evelyn Marsh, Lady Beatrice's cousin, a slight young woman whose anxious glances and fidgeting hands suggested a nature ill at ease. Dinner was announced, and the party moved to the dining room, where a table groaned under the weight of roast goose, plum pudding, and crystal decanters. Sir Reginald presided with jovial authority, regaling them with tales of his travels, while Lady Beatrice smiled faintly, her fork toying with her food. Miss Marple, seated between Dr. Haydock and Evelyn, listened more than she spoke, her unassuming manner inviting confidences. She learned that Evelyn had arrived only that morning, summoned unexpectedly by Beatrice. "She insisted I come," Evelyn whispered, her voice barely audible over the clink of cutlery. "I don't know why." As the evening wore on, the snow thickened, sealing the manor in an icy embrace. The guests retired to the drawing-room for coffee, where Clara's sharp tongue turned to local scandals, and Leonard Price's gaze lingered on Lady Beatrice with an intensity that Miss Marple found disquieting. Sir Reginald, meanwhile, grew louder with each glass of port, his laughter ringing hollow. Beatrice excused herself briefly, returning with a strained smile and a shawl drawn tightly about her shoulders. Miss Marple, sipping her coffee, observed the interplay of glances and gestures, the way Evelyn's eyes followed Beatrice, the way Clara's lips curled at Sir Reginald's jests, the way Dr. Haydock's fingers tightened on his cup when Leonard mentioned a recent business deal. It was a tapestry of human nature, woven with threads of envy, fear, and ambition. She sensed that Havford Manor, for all its festive glow, was a stage set for something darker. As the clock struck 10, the party began to disperse, the guests murmuring about the cold corridors and early beds. Miss Marple lingered, her knitting in hand, watching as Sir Reginald clapped Leonard on the shoulder and Beatrice whispered something to Evelyn. The fire crackled, casting long shadows, and outside, the snow fell ceaselessly, trapping them all. Within the manor's walls, Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind alert. She had the distinct impression that this Christmas would be unlike any other, and that the truth, like the snow, was already piling up, waiting to be uncovered. Chapter 2. The fall the snow continued its silent siege on Havford Manor, cloaking the world beyond its walls in an impenetrable white shroud. Within, the festive spirit of Christmas Eve pulsed with a determined gaiety, as though the guests were resolved to defy the storm's ominous weight. The grand dining room, aglow with candlelight, had been the stage for a sumptuous feast, and now the party had migrated to the drawing-room, where a pianoforte stood, adorned with sprigs of holly. Miss Jane Marple, seated in a high-backed chair, near the hearth, her knitting a soft counterpoint to the crackling fire, observed the scene with her usual unobtrusive acuity. Her mild eyes, framed by spectacles, missed nothing, not the flicker of unease in a smile, nor the subtle shift of a glance. Sir Reginald Thornton, his face flushed with wine and bonhomie, presided over the gathering like a benevolent monarch. His laughter boomed as he urged Clara Winthrop to lead a carol, his hand clapping time with exaggerated vigour. Clara, her sharp features softened by the candlelight, obliged with a rendition of God Rest Ye Merry Gentlemen, her voice surprisingly rich, though her eyes gleamed with a malice that suggested she sang more for effect than devotion. Lady Beatrice, resplendent in a crimson gown that caught the light like polished garnet, sat at the pianoforte, her fingers coaxing a delicate melody from the keys. Yet Miss Marple noted the tension in her posture, The way her shoulders stiffened when Sir Reginald's hand brushed her arm, and the fleeting shadow that crossed her face when she thought no one watched. Evelyn Marsh, Beatrice's cousin, hovered near the instrument, her pale hands twisting the fringe of her shawl. Her nervous energy was palpable, her eyes darting between Beatrice and the other guests as though seeking reassurance. Leonard Price, the sleek business associate, lounged against a bookcase, a glass of brandy in hand, his smile polished but his gaze predatory as it lingered on Beatrice. Dr. Ernest Haydock, the physician, stood apart, his wiry frame taut, his expression one of distracted concern as he sipped his coffee. The room, for all its warmth and music, thrummed with undercurrents, jealousy, perhaps, or fear, or some deeper secret yet to be unveiled. Miss Marple, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically, allowed the conversation to wash over her. Clara's barbed remarks about village gossip, Sir Reginald's anecdotes of his days in London, Leonard's smooth compliments to Beatrice all were threads in a tapestry she was beginning to discern. She noted how Evelyn's fingers trembled when she turned the pages of the carol book, and how Beatrice's smile faltered when Sir Reginald raised his glass in a toast to our happy home. There was a fragility here, a brittleness beneath the festive veneer, and Miss Marple's mind, honed by years of quiet observation, began to trace its contours as the clock on the mantel struck midnight. The carols gave way to yawns and murmurs of bedtime. Sir Reginald, his voice slurring slightly, proposed a final toast. To Christmas and to all of us gathered here, he declared, his glass raised high. The guests echoed the sentiment, though Miss Marple observed that Beatrice's glass remained untouched, her lips pressed into a thin line. The party began to disperse, the women gathering shawls, the men draining their drinks. Beatrice rose from the pianoforte, her movements graceful but deliberate, and excused herself, mentioning a need to fetch a book from the library. Evelyn started to follow, but Beatrice waved her off with a gentle smile. "I'll only be a moment." "Dear," she said, her voice soft but firm. Miss Marple, lingering by the fire, watched as Beatrice's crimson gown disappeared through the drawing-room door. The others drifted toward the staircase, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpets. Sir Reginald, swaying slightly, clapped Leonard on the shoulder and muttered something about a business matter to discuss in the morning. Clara, her eyes narrowing, remarked to Dr. Haydock that Beatrice seemed out of sorts that evening, her tone dripping with insinuation. Dr. Haydock merely nodded, his face unreadable, and offered to escort Clara to her room. The manor settled into a hushed stillness, broken only by the occasional creak of settling wood and the distant howl of the wind. Miss Marple, her knitting tucked into her bag, made her way to the staircase, her steps slow and deliberate. She had reached the first landing when a piercing scream rent the air, sharp and raw, echoing through the cavernous hall. It was followed by a dull thud, a sound that sent a chill through her bones. She paused, her hand on the banister, as doors flew open above and footsteps thundered toward the source. Miss Marple descended swiftly, her age no hindrance to her purpose, and joined the knot of guests gathering at the base of the grand staircase. There, sprawled on the polished marble floor, lay Lady Beatrice, her crimson gown fanned out like spilled wine, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. Her eyes, wide and staring, held a frozen expression of shock, and a thin trickle of blood seeped from her temple, pooling beneath her dark hair. Sir Reginald, his face drained of colour, knelt beside her, his hands hovering uselessly. "Beatrice," he gasped, his voice cracking. My God, she must have tripped. The stairs, They're so steep. Dr. Haydock pushed through the crowd, his medical bag already in hand. He knelt beside Beatrice, his fingers probing her neck. With practiced efficiency, the guests stood frozen, their faces a tableau of horror and disbelief. Evelyn, her hands pressed to her mouth, let out a choked sob, her body trembling violently. Clara's lips parted, but for once no sharp remark. Emerged. Leonard Price's face was a mask, his eyes unreadable, while his fingers tightened around the brandy glass he still held. "She's gone," Dr. Haydock said at last, his voice steady but heavy. "Her neck is broken. It must have been instantaneous." He rose, his expression grim, and turned to Sir Reginald. "I'm so sorry, Reginald. It appears to be a tragic accident." Sir Reginald buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. "She'd had wine," he mumbled, as though to himself. "And those slippers, so slippery. Oh, Beatrice, why did you go alone?" His words were laced with anguish, yet Miss Marple, standing quietly at the edge of the group, noted a faint tremor in his voice, a note that struck her as rehearsed. She stepped closer, her eyes scanning the scene with the precision of a seamstress, inspecting a flawed stitch. Beatrice's body lay several feet from the base of the stairs, too far, it seemed, for a simple fall. The hem of her gown was caught on a protruding nail at the top step, a jagged splinter of metal that glinted in the chandelier's light. Yet the fabric was not torn, merely snagged, as though she had paused there before her descent. Miss Marple gaze travelled to Beatrice's hands, which were splayed awkwardly, one wrist bearing a faint scratch, barely visible against her pale skin. It was not the mark of a fall, but of something sharper, more deliberate. Evelyn's sobs grew louder, and Dr. Haydock moved to comfort her, his arm steadying her shaking frame. "Come, Miss Marsh," he said gently. "Let's get you to your room. There's nothing more to be done here tonight." Evelyn nodded, her face buried in her hands, and allowed herself to be led away. Clara, her composure regained, muttered something about the dangers of grand houses and retreated upstairs, her footsteps sharp and purposeful. Leonard Price set his glass on a nearby table, his movements slow, and followed without a word. Sir Reginald remained by Beatrice's side, his head bowed until Dr. Haydock returned and urged him to retire. "I'll see to everything, Reginald," the doctor said, his tone professional but kind. "We'll need to wait for the authorities, but the snow, it may be days." Sir Reginald nodded numbly and allowed himself to be guided to his study, his steps heavy. Miss Marple lingered, her presence unobtrusive yet deliberate. She approached Dr. Haydock, who was covering Beatrice's body with a sheet from a nearby linen closet. "A terrible thing," she said softly, her voice carrying the gentle cadence of condolence. "Did you notice, Doctor, the position of her body, so far from the stairs?" Dr. Haydock paused, his eyes meeting hers with a flicker of surprise. "Shock can make distances seem strange," he replied, but his tone lacked conviction. "She likely stumbled and fell with some force." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, her smile serene but her eyes sharp. "And that nail at the top. Most curious, don't you think? It seems almost placed to catch her gown." She let the observation hang, her tone light, as though discussing a minor household quirk. Dr. Haydock's brow furrowed, but he said nothing, merely nodding as he adjusted the sheet. Miss Marple stepped back, her mind already threading through the inconsistencies, the nail, the scratch, the distance from the stairs. These were not the marks of an accident, but of something staged, something deliberate. She recalled Beatrice's unease throughout the evening, the way her fingers had tightened on the pianoforte keys when Sir Reginald spoke, the way Evelyn had watched her with anxious devotion. There was a pattern here, half-formed but undeniable, and Miss Marple knew it would require patience to unravel. The other guests had retreated to their rooms, and the manor fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the wind's mournful wail. Miss Marple ascended the staircase, pausing at the top to examine the nail more closely. It was not rusted or worn, but freshly driven, its head slightly bent as though struck in haste. She touched it lightly, her fingers tracing the snagged threads of Beatrice's gown, and filed the detail away. In her room, she sat by the window, her knitting resumed, the needles moving with a steady rhythm that belied the whirl of her thoughts. The snow continued to fall, sealing Havford Manor in its icy grip, and with it the secrets of its inhabitants. Miss Marple's mind turned to Sir Reginald's grief, so immediate yet so theatrical, to Evelyn's terror, which seemed to stem from more than shock, to Leonard's calculating silence, and Clara's barely concealed delight in the drama. Dr. Haydock, too, puzzled her. His professionalism was impeccable, yet his distraction suggested knowledge he did not share. And Beatrice herself, poor Beatrice, whose final moments had been marked by fear rather than festivity. Miss Marple set her knitting aside and gazed out at the snow, her reflection faint in the darkened glass. She had seen death before, in its many guises, and knew that accidents were rarely as simple as they appeared. The fall, she was certain, was no accident, but a carefully orchestrated act, its perpetrator hidden among the mourners. The truth, like the snow, was piling up, and she would sift through it with the care of one who knew that even the smallest flake could reveal the storm's design. Chapter 3. The morning. The dawn of Christmas morning broke over Havford Manor with a bleak, unyielding pallor, the snow still falling in a relentless curtain that sealed the estate from the world beyond. The festive promise of the previous evening lay shattered, replaced by a heavy silence that seemed to permeate the very walls. Miss Jane Marple, rising early despite the restless night, sat by her bedroom window, her knitting needles idle for once as she gazed at the endless white expanse. The manor, with its grand facade and twinkling lights, had transformed overnight into a mausoleum, its beauty now a stark contrast to the tragedy within. Her mind, sharp and tireless, sifted through the events of the previous night, piecing together the fragments of what she was certain was no accident. Downstairs, the household moved with the sluggishness of grief. The servants, their faces drawn, went about their duties with hushed steps, their usual chatter stifled by the weight of Lady Beatrice's death. Miss Marple descended to the dining room, where a subdued breakfast had been laid out silver trays of scones, a tureen of porridge, and a pot of tea, all untouched by the festive garnishes of the previous day. Sir Reginald Thornton, seated at the head of the table, was a shadow of the jovial host he had been. His eyes were red-rimmed, his hands trembling as he clutched a cup of black coffee. Yet Miss Marple, settling into a chair with her customary unobtrusive grace, noted the way his gaze flickered toward the door, as though expecting or dreading an intrusion. The other guests trickled in, each marked by the night's horror. Evelyn Marsh, Beatrice's cousin, was a wraith, her face pale and her eyes swollen from weeping. She sat beside Miss Marple, her hands twisting a damp handkerchief, her every movement betraying a fragility that bordered on collapse. Clara Winthrop, the sharp-tongued widow, entered with a briskness that seemed almost defiant, her black dress impeccable, but her lips pursed in a way that suggested she relished the drama, however grim. Leonard Price, Sir Reginald's business associate, was impeccably groomed, his dark suit pressed, but his fingers drummed restlessly on the table, betraying an inner agitation. Dr. Ernest Haydock, the last to arrive, carried his medical bag. His wiry frame taut with a tension that Miss Marple found intriguing. His eyes, usually keen, were clouded with preoccupation as he murmured a greeting. Sir Reginald broke the silence, his voice hoarse but resolute. "Beatrice would not have wanted us to mope," he said, his words directed at no one in particular. "We must carry on, for her sake. A quiet Christmas, but a Christmas nonetheless." The sentiment was met with murmurs of assent, though Evelyn's shoulders shook with a suppressed sob, and Clara's eyebrows arched in a way that suggested skepticism. Miss Marple, sipping her tea, observed the dynamics with her usual clarity. Sir Reginald's insistence on normalcy struck her as performative, a veneer to mask something deeper guilt, perhaps, or fear. The conversation, such as it was, turned to practical matters. The snow had rendered the roads impassable, delaying the arrival of any coroner or constable. Dr. Haydock, as the only medical authority present, had taken charge of the formalities, recording Beatrice's death as an accident pending further inquiry. "A formality," he said, his tone clipped. The fall was clear enough, a broken neck, instantaneous. He glanced at Sir Reginald, who nodded vigorously, as though eager to close the matter. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, her mind recalling the oddities of the scene, the nail at the top of the stairs, the scratch on Beatrice's wrist, the unnatural distance of her body from the steps. She said nothing, but her silence was a net, gathering every word and gesture. Clara, never one to let a moment pass without comment, leaned forward, her voice cutting through the gloom. "Beatrice was always a bit clumsy, wasn't she? Those grand stairs, and in those flimsy slippers. No surprise she took a tumble." The remark was delivered with a casual cruelty that made Evelyn flinch. "Don't speak of her like that," she snapped, her voice trembling with outrage. "Beatrice was graceful, always. She didn't just fall." Her words ended in a sob, and she buried her face in her handkerchief, her shoulders heaving. "Sir?" Reginald's face darkened, but he said nothing, his fingers tightening around his cup. Leonard Price, who had been silent, glanced at Evelyn with a flicker of interest, his lips twitching as though suppressing a comment. Dr. Haydock cleared his throat, his tone soothing. "Grief makes us all say things we don't mean," he said, his eyes on Clara. "Let's not judge too harshly." Clara sniffed, unrepentant, but subsided, her gaze darting to Sir Reginald with a calculating glint. Miss Marple, her expression one of gentle concern, turned to Evelyn. "My dear, you knew Lady Beatrice so well. Did she often walk the stairs alone at night?" The question was asked with such mildness that it seemed almost inconsequential, yet it hung in the air like a delicate probe. Evelyn hesitated, her eyes flicking toward Sir Reginald, who was staring into his coffee. I don't know," she stammered. "She said she was going to the library for a book, but she didn't usually." Her voice trailed off, and she looked down, her hands twisting her handkerchief into knots. Sir Reginald stirred, his voice gruff. "She loved her books," he said, as though the explanation sufficed. "Always slipping off to read, even late. I told her those stairs were treacherous, but she never listened." His words were heavy with regret, yet Miss Marple noted the way his eyes avoided hers, the way his fingers fidgeted with the edge of the tablecloth. There was a falseness here, a note that jarred in the symphony of his grief. The meal concluded. In near silence, the guests dispersing to their rooms or the drawing-room, where a fire burned low, Miss Marple lingered, her knitting resumed, her needles a steady counterpoint to her racing thoughts. She had seen many tragedies in her time, and knew that the truth often lay in the smallest discrepancies, the pause before a reply, the glance that lingered too long. Beatrice's death, she was certain, was no accident, but a carefully constructed illusion. The question was, who had crafted it, and why? She rose and made her way to the drawing-room, where Clara sat by the window, her embroidery a pretense as she watched the snow. Miss Marple settled nearby, her knitting a natural companion to conversation. "Such a shock," she said, her voice soft. "Poor Lady Beatrice. You knew her well, I suppose?" Clara's needle paused, her lips curling in a way that suggested she relished the opportunity to speak. "Well enough," Clara replied, her tone laced with disdain. Beatrice was a sweet thing, but naive, always throwing money at charities, as if Reginald didn't need it more. "He's not half as rich as he pretends, you know." Her eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of shared gossip, and Miss Marple nodded encouragingly, her expression one of polite interest. "Oh," she prompted, "I thought Sir Reginald's ventures were quite successful." Clara snorted. "Successful at losing money, perhaps. His investments have been disasters, from what I hear. Beatrice's fortune was the only thing keeping this place afloat, and now—" She trailed off, her needle resuming its work with a vicious jab. Miss Marple stored the information away, her mind turning to the implications. A husband in financial straits, a wife with a fortune such circumstances had led to darker deeds than a staged fall. Evelyn entered the room, her movements hesitant, and Miss Marple seized the opportunity to draw her into conversation. "My dear, you must be exhausted," she said, patting the seat beside her. "Come, sit. Tell me about your cousin. She seems such a gentle soul." Evelyn's eyes filled with tears, but she sat, her hands clutching her handkerchief. She whispered. "Beatrice was kind, always, but lately, she was worried. She wouldn't tell me why, not exactly. Just said she felt watched, like someone was always there." Miss Marple's needles paused, her eyes gentle but piercing. "Watched," she repeated. "How curious. Did she mention anyone in particular?" Evelyn shook her head, her voice barely audible. "No, but she looked at Reginald sometimes, when he wasn't watching, like she was afraid." The admission hung between them, and Evelyn's eyes widened, as though she regretted speaking. She rose abruptly, murmuring an excuse, and fled the room. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her mind weaving the threads together. Evelyn's fear, Clara's insinuations, Sir Reginald's evasiveness all pointed to a household riddled with secrets. She recalled the scratch on Beatrice's wrist, the nail at the top of the stairs, and the odd positioning of the body. These were not the marks of a careless fall, but of a struggle, perhaps, or a deliberate act disguised as misfortune. She needed more, a clearer glimpse of the pattern, and she knew it would come from the unguarded moments of those around her, later. She sought out Dr. Haydock, finding him in the library, his medical bag open as he sorted through papers. "Dr. Haydock," she said, her tone one of innocent curiosity, "you've been so kind, taking charge in this awful time. Tell me, was Lady Beatrice in good health before?" She let the question trail off, her eyes meeting his with a disarming smile. He hesitated, his fingers tightening on a vial of pills. "She was healthy enough," he said, his voice cautious. a bit anxious perhaps, but nothing serious. These last weeks she seemed distracted. He stopped, as though weighing his words, and Miss Marple pressed gently. Anxious, poor thing. Did she seek your advice? Dr. Haydock's jaw tightened, but he nodded. She asked about sleeping draughts once, but I advised against them. She didn't pursue it. His tone was final, yet Miss Marple sensed a reticence, a reluctance to say more. She thanked him and withdrew, her mind alight with possibilities. An anxious woman, a husband in financial ruin, a cousin who sensed danger. These were the outlines of a tragedy far darker than a misstep on a staircase. The snow continued to fall, trapping them all within the manor's walls, and Miss Marple knew that the truth, like the storm, was building, waiting for the moment to break. She returned to her room, her knitting resumed, her needles clicking with the steady rhythm of one who knew that patience, above all, would unravel the knot of deception. Chapter 4. The inquest deferred. The snow continued its relentless assault on Havford Manor, piling high against the windows and rendering the world beyond a featureless void. Christmas Day had passed in a haze of grief and suspicion, and now, on the morning of Boxing Day, the manor seemed to hold its breath, as though waiting for the storm to relent or the truth to emerge. Miss Jane Marple, ever an early riser, sat in her room, her knitting needles still for the moment as she gazed at the endless white expanse. Her mind, however, was far from idle, weaving through the events of the past 2 days with the precision of a needle threading a complex pattern. Lady Beatrice's death, so swiftly labelled an accident, bore the marks of something far more sinister, and Miss Marple was determined to uncover the hand that had crafted the deception. Downstairs, the household moved with a muted efficiency, the servants' faces etched with strain as they maintained the rituals of hospitality under the shadow of tragedy. Miss Marple descended to the morning room, where a modest breakfast of toast, marmalade, and tea awaited. The grandeur of the previous day's feasts had been abandoned, replaced by a simplicity that mirrored the sombre mood. Sir Reginald Thornton was absent, his place at the table empty, but the other guests were present, each marked by the weight of the previous night's horror. Evelyn Marsh, her eyes red and her hands trembling, picked at a piece of toast, her gaze fixed on the tablecloth as though it held answers to her grief. Clara Winthrop, her black dress a stark contrast to her sharp features, sipped her tea with a composure that bordered on indifference, her eyes darting about the room in search of gossip. Leonard Price, his suit immaculate, sat with a newspaper he did not read, his fingers tapping a restless rhythm. Dr. Ernest Haydock, his medical bag at his side, looked weary, his usual briskness tempered by a preoccupation that Miss Marple found telling. The silence was broken by Dr. Haydock, who cleared his throat and addressed the group. With the roads still blocked, I've done what I can to document the incident, he said, his voice measured. I've recorded Lady Beatrice's death as an accident caused by a fall. The coroner will review it when the snow clears, but for now, that's the official word. His eyes met Sir Reginald's empty chair, and Miss Marple noted the slight tightening of his jaw, as though the words cost him effort. Clara set down her teacup with a clink. Very sensible, she said, her tone clipped. No need to drag things out. Poor Beatrice tripped, and that's that. Her words were brisk, but her eyes gleamed with a curiosity that suggested she relished the possibility of scandal. Evelyn's head snapped up, her face flushed with indignation. It's not that's that, she cried, her voice trembling. Beatrice didn't just trip. She was careful. Her outburst ended in a sob, and she pressed her napkin to her face, her shoulders shaking. Leonard Price glanced at Evelyn, his expression unreadable, and murmured, "Grief does make us see things differently." The comment was neutral, yet Miss Marple detected a faint edge, as though he were testing the waters. Dr. Haydock's lips pressed into a thin line, but he said nothing, his fingers tightening on his bag. Miss Marple, her expression one of gentle concern, leaned toward Evelyn. "My dear, you're quite right to feel so strongly," she said softly. Lady Beatrice was indeed careful, wasn't she? Did she often go to the library so late, do you think? Evelyn hesitated, her eyes darting to the door as though expecting Sir Reginald to appear. "No," she whispered. "She didn't. She said she wanted a book, but it wasn't like her. She usually read in her room." Her voice was barely audible, and she looked down, her hands twisting her napkin into knots. Miss Marple nodded, her smile serene but her mind alight with the confirmation that Beatrice's errand had been unusual. Perhaps orchestrated. The meal concluded, and the guests dispersed, their movements heavy with the strain of enforced confinement. Miss Marple, her knitting bag in hand, made her way to the drawing-room, where a fire burned low, casting flickering shadows on the walls. She settled into a chair, her needles resuming their steady rhythm, and considered her next step. The nail at the top of the stairs, the scratch on Beatrice's wrist, the odd positioning of her body. These were not the marks of a careless fall, but of a deliberate act, staged with care. She needed to see the body again, to confirm her suspicions. And she needed to probe the household further, to uncover the motives that simmered beneath the surface. An opportunity presented itself when Dr. Haydock entered the drawing-room, his face drawn. Miss Marple looked up, her expression one of polite deference. "Dr. Haydock, you've been so diligent," she said, her voice warm. "I wonder if I might pay my respects to Lady Beatrice. It would ease my mind to say a quiet goodbye." The request was made with such gentle sincerity that it seemed impossible to refuse, yet Dr. Haydock hesitated, his eyes searching hers. "Of course," he said at last, his tone cautious. "She's in the parlour, under a sheet. It's not a pleasant sight, Miss Marple." His warning was kind, but Miss Marple merely smiled, her resolve unshaken. "I understand," she said, "but I feel it's right." Dr. Haydock nodded and led her to the parlour, a cold, dimly lit room where Beatrice's body lay on a table, covered by a white sheet. The doctor lifted the sheet, revealing Beatrice's pale face, her eyes closed and her features serene in death. Miss Marple stepped closer, her eyes scanning the body with a precision that belied her mild demeanour. The bruising on Beatrice's arms, faint but unmistakable, suggested she had been gripped tightly, perhaps in a struggle. The scratch on her wrist, which Miss Marple had noted the previous night, was clearer, now a thin, deliberate mark, as though made by a sharp edge, not a fall. She leaned closer, her fingers hovering over the wrist, and noted a tiny fleck of metal embedded in the skin, barely visible. It was not the rough splinter of a nail, but something finer, perhaps a piece of jewellery or a clasp. Miss Marple straightened, her face composed, but her mind racing. "Such a tragedy," she murmured, her tone one of condolence. "Did you notice the bruising, doctor? It seems rather pronounced for a fall." Dr. Haydock's eyes flickered with surprise, but he nodded. "Yes, I saw it," he said, his voice low. "It could have happened when she struck the stairs. The impact was severe." His explanation was plausible, yet Miss Marple sensed reluctance, as though he were guarding a thought he did not wish to share. She thanked him and returned to the drawing room. Her knitting resumed as she pondered the new evidence. The bruising and the scratch were pieces of a puzzle, pointing to a struggle before the fall. The fleck of metal suggested a specific object, one that might identify the culprit if she could find it. Her thoughts turned to Sir Reginald, whose grief seemed too polished, and to Evelyn, whose fear hinted at knowledge she dared not voice. Clara's gossip, Leonard's calculating silence, and Dr. Haydock's reticence all added layers to the mystery. And Miss Marple knew that the truth lay in the interplay of their secrets. Later, she sought out Evelyn, finding her in the conservatory, a glass-walled room filled with wilting ferns and the faint scent of damp earth. Evelyn stood by a window, her face pressed against the glass, her breath fogging the pane. Miss Marple approached, her step soft, and offered a gentle smile. "My dear, you look so weary," she said, her voice warm. "Come, sit with me. Tell me about Beatrice. It helps to speak of those we've lost." Evelyn hesitated, then joined Miss Marple on a wicker bench, her hands clutching her shawl. "She was my only family," she whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "After my parents died, Beatrice took me in. She was so kind, but she changed. These last months, she was nervous, always looking over her shoulder." Her voice trembled, and Miss Marple patted her hand, her touch soothing but her eyes sharp. "Nervous?" she prompted. "Did she ever say what troubled her?" Evelyn bit her lip, her gaze darting to the door. "She didn't say much," she admitted. "But once, when we were alone, she said she felt trapped. She mentioned money and how it made people do terrible things." Her words were halting, as though she feared their weight, and Miss Marple nodded encouragingly, her needles clicking. Softly, "Money can indeed bring out the worst," she said, her tone light but probing. "Did she speak of anyone in particular? Sir Reginald, perhaps?" Evelyn's eyes widened, and she shook her head quickly. No, she didn't say his name, but she looked at him differently, like she didn't trust him." The admission was a whisper, and Evelyn's hands tightened on her shawl, her knuckles white dot. Miss Marple let the moment pass, her mind storing the revelation. Beatrice's fear of her husband, coupled with Clara's hints about his financial troubles, painted a damning picture. Yet she needed more evidence that could not be dismissed as conjecture. She thanked Evelyn and rose, her knitting bag in hand, and made her way to the library, where she hoped to find clues to Beatrice's final errand. The library was a vast oak-panelled room, its shelves lined with leather-bound volumes and its air heavy with the scent of old paper. A single lamp burned on a table, casting long shadows. Miss Marple moved to the spot where Beatrice had supposedly gone for a book, her eyes scanning the shelves. A volume of poetry lay open on a table, its pages marked by a ribbon, but it was undisturbed, as though placed there for effect. She ran her fingers along the shelf, noting the dust that clung to the books, and found no sign of recent handling. Beatrice's errand, she concluded, had been a pretext, perhaps to meet someone or to escape the drawing room's tension. As she turned to leave, she heard a soft creak from the corridor. She paused, her senses alert, and stepped to the door, peering out. The hallway was empty, but a faint scent of tobacco lingered, suggesting someone had passed by moments before. Miss Marple's lips curved in a faint smile. The manor was alive with secrets, and its inhabitants were restless, their movements betraying their unease. She returned to her room, her knitting resumed, her needles a steady rhythm against the whirl of her thoughts. The snow continued to fall, trapping the household in its icy grip, and Miss Marple knew that the truth, like the storm, was gathering force. The bruising, the scratch, the fleck of metal. Evelyn's ferule were threads in a tapestry of deception, and she was determined to unravel it before the snow cleared and the chance for justice slipped away. She sat by her window, her knitting, a quiet companion, and watched the flakes fall, each one a reminder that even the smallest detail could reveal the design of a murderer's hand. Chapter 5. The financial thread, the snow, unyielding in its descent, had transformed Havford Manor into a fortress of ice, its grand halls and festive adornments now a stark backdrop to the tragedy that gripped its inhabitants. The third day since Lady Beatrice's death dawned with a grey, oppressive light, the storm showing no sign of abating. Miss Jane Marple, seated by her bedroom window, her knitting needles momentarily still, gazed at the endless white expanse with a calm that belied the whirl of her thoughts. The events of the past day's Beatrice's fall, the nail at the top of the stairs, the scratch on her wrist, the bruising on her arms formed a pattern in her mind, one that pointed not to accident but to a calculated act of violence. Her task now was to trace the threads of motive, and she suspected that money, that most ancient of temptations, lay at the heart of the matter. Downstairs, the household stirred with a listless energy, the servants moving like shadows as they maintained the pretense of normalcy. Miss Marple descended to the morning room, where a sparse breakfast of tea, toast, and preserves awaited the opulence of earlier meals abandoned in the face of grief. Sir Reginald Thornton sat at the head of the table, his face haggard, his eyes shadowed by sleeplessness. He nodded curtly as Miss Marple entered, his hands fidgeting with a silver spoon, a gesture she noted as betraying more than simple mourning. Evelyn Marsh was absent, likely still in her room, her fragile state a concern that Miss Marple tucked away for later. Clara Winthrop, her black dress as severe as her expression, sipped her tea with a primness that suggested she was biding her time for the next piece of gossip. Leonard Price, his dark eyes watchful, buttered a piece of toast with deliberate care, while Dr. Ernest Haydock, his medical bag at his feet, seemed lost in thought, his fork idle. The silence was heavy, broken only by the clink of china and the distant howl of the wind. Miss Marple, settling into her chair with her customary unobtrusive grace, broke the quiet with a gentle remark. "Such a trying time," she said, her voice soft but clear. "I do hope the snow clears soon, for everyone's sake." The comment was innocuous, yet it prompted a flicker of response, a tightening of Sir Reginald's jaw, a glance from Clara, a pause in Leonard's movements. Dr. Haydock merely nodded, his eyes distant. Clara, never one to resist an opening, set down her cup. "It's dreadful, being cooped up like this," she said, her tone laced with a theatrical sigh. "Poor Beatrice would have hated it. She was always flitting about, wasn't she? Spending money like water, too." Her lips curved in a faint smirk, and Miss Marple seized the opportunity, her expression one of polite curiosity. "Oh," she said, her needles clicking softly as she began to knit. "Lady Beatrice was generous, then. I suppose she had a great deal to give." The question was asked with such mildness that it seemed almost idle, yet it hung in the air, inviting elaboration. Clara's eyes gleamed, eager to share. "Generous to a fault," she said, leaning forward. "Always funding some orphanage or church roof. Reginald didn't approve, you know. He'd grumble about it, say she was throwing away their future. Not that he's short of funds, of course." Her tone suggested otherwise, and Miss Marple noted the way Sir Reginald's spoon stilled, his face impassive but his knuckles white. Leonard Price, who had been listening with apparent disinterest, spoke up, his voice smooth. "Ventures have had their ups and downs," he said, his eyes on his toast, "but Beatrice's inheritance was a steady anchor. It's no secret it kept the manor running." His words were casual, yet Miss Marple detected a calculated edge, as though he were testing Sir Reginald's reaction. Sir Reginald's lips pressed into a thin line, but he said nothing, his gaze fixed on the table. Miss Marple's needles paused, her eyes meeting Leonard's with a disarming smile. "Inheritance," she prompted, her tone one of innocent interest. "How fortunate for Sir Reginald. Was it a substantial sum?" The question was direct, yet cloaked in her gentle demeanour, and Leonard hesitated, his fingers tightening on his knife. "Substantial enough," he said at last, his smile tight. Her father's shipping business left her well provided for. It was hers to manage, of course, until... He trailed off, his eyes flicking to Sir Reginald, who stirred, as though roused from a trance. "Until her death," Sir Reginald finished, his voice gruff. "It passes to me now, naturally, but I'd give it all to have her back." His words were heavy with emotion, yet Miss Marple noted the way his eyes avoided hers, the way his hands clenched the spoon. The admission of the inheritance's transfer was a revelation, a thread that tightened the pattern in her mind. A husband in financial straits, a wife whose wealth he could only access through her death. The motive was as old as greed itself. The meal concluded, and the guests dispersed, their movements sluggish under the weight of confinement. Miss Marple, her knitting bag in hand, made her way to the library, where she hoped to engage Leonard Price further. She found him alone, standing by a window, his hands clasped behind his back as he stared at the snow. He turned at her approach, his smile polished but wary. "Mr. Price," she said, settling into a chair with her knitting, "you seem to know a great deal about Sir Reginald's affairs. I suppose you've worked closely with him." Her tone was conversational, yet her eyes were sharp, and Leonard's smile faltered for a moment. "Closely enough," he replied, moving to a nearby chair. "Reginald's investments are ambitious, but not always sound. He's taken risks that haven't paid off. Beatrice's money was a lifeline, but even that wasn't endless." His words were measured, yet Miss Marple sensed a relish in his candour, as though he enjoyed exposing his associate's weaknesses. "How interesting," she said, her needles clicking steadily. "And Lady Beatrice was she aware of these difficulties?" The question was asked with such mildness that it seemed almost incidental. Yet Leonard's eyes narrowed, his fingers drumming on the armrest. "She knew enough," he said, his tone cautious. "She'd question Reginald sometimes, ask why he needed more funds. He didn't like it, said she didn't understand business." His lips twitched, as though suppressing a smirk, and Miss Marple stored the detail away, her mind turning to the tensions that must have simmered between husband and wife. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Clara, who swept into the room with a rustle of silk, her eyes alight with purpose. "Miss Marple, Mr. Price," she said, her voice bright but edged with malice. "Plotting in the library, are we? I dare say. There's plenty to talk about, with poor Beatrice gone." Her words were laced with insinuation, and Miss Marple smiled, unruffled. "Merely passing the time," she said, her needles never pausing. "Though I confess, I'm curious about Lady Beatrice's generosity. You mentioned her charities, Mrs. Winthrop. Did she have any particular causes?" The question was a gentle probe, and Clara seized it eagerly, settling into a chair with a flourish. Oh, she had dozens, Clara said, her tone dripping with disdain. Orphans, widows, stray. Dogs she'd give to anyone who asked. I told her she was being fleeced, but she wouldn't listen. Reginald was furious, of course, said she was undermining his plans. They had words about it, more than once. Her eyes gleamed, and Miss Marple noted the relish with which she shared the couple's discord. Words, she prompted, her voice soft. How distressing. Were they often at odds? Clara hesitated, perhaps sensing the depth of the question, but her love of gossip won out. Not openly, she admitted, leaning forward, but you could feel it. Beatrice would go quiet when he raised his voice, and he'd storm off to his study. I heard them once, a few weeks ago, arguing about her money. He said she was ruining him. Her words were a thunderbolt, and Miss Marple's needles paused, her eyes meeting Clara's with a serene intensity. Ruining him, she repeated, her tone one of mild surprise. How curious. And did she say anything in return? Clara shrugged, her lips pursing. Not much, she said. Just that she'd do what she thought right. Stubborn, for all her softness. The admission hung in the air, and Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her mind weaving the new thread into the pattern. Beatrice's control over her fortune, her defiance of her husband's demands, these were sparks that could ignite a deadly fire. Leonard, who had listened in silence, rose abruptly, murmuring an excuse about correspondence. Miss Marple watched him go, noting the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands clenched at his sides. Clara, too, departed, her mission of gossip fulfilled, leaving Miss Marple alone in the library. She rose and moved to the window, her eyes scanning the snow, as her thoughts turned to Sir Reginald. His financial desperation, confirmed by both Leonard and Clara, was a motive as clear as the ice outside. Yet she needed more evidence that could not be dismissed as hearsay. She decided to explore the Manor further, her curiosity cloaked in the guise of an aimless stroll. She made her way to the upper floors, her steps soft on the thick carpets, and paused outside Sir Reginald's study, a heavy oak door that stood closed. She tested the handle, finding it locked, and recalled his explanation that Beatrice had kept it so for privacy. The lock was sturdy, but Miss Marple's mind turned to the possibility of what it concealed: papers, perhaps, or something more incriminating. Her exploration was interrupted by the sound of footsteps, and she stepped back as Dr. Haydock appeared, his medical bag in hand. He started at the sight of her, his face registering surprise. "Miss Marple," he said, his tone polite but guarded. "Lost your way." His question was light, yet his eyes searched hers, and she smiled, unruffled. "Not at all," she said, her voice warm, "merely stretching my legs. These old houses are so fascinating, don't you think? So many secrets in their walls." Her words were innocent, yet Dr. Haydock's jaw tightened, and he nodded curtly. "Indeed," he said, moving past her. "If you'll excuse me, I must check on Miss Marsh." He disappeared down the corridor, and Miss Marple watched him go, her mind noting his unease. The doctor, she suspected, knew more than he shared, his professional demeanour a shield for his own doubts. She returned to the library, her knitting resumed, and considered her next move. The financial motive was clear, but the means, the nail, the scratch, the bruising, required closer scrutiny. She resolved to speak with Evelyn again, to coax more from her fragile memory, and to observe Sir Reginald closely, to catch the moment. When his mask slipped, the snow continued to fall, sealing the manor in its icy embrace, and Miss Marple knew that the truth, like the storm, was building, waiting for the moment to break. She sat by the fire, her needles clicking with the steady rhythm of one who knew that patience, above all, would unravel the knot of deception. Chapter 6. The locked door of the snow. An unrelenting captor continued to entomb Havford Manor, its drifts piling high against the windows and cloaking the world in a silence that amplified the tensions within. The fourth day since Lady Beatrice's death dawned with a leaden sky, the storm's persistence mirroring the stubborn mystery that gripped the household. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her room with her knitting needle still, gazed at the white expanse beyond her window, her mild eyes reflecting a mind that never rested. The threads of the case Beatrice's fall, the nail at the top of the stairs, the scratch on her wrist, the bruising and the financial motive were weaving into a pattern, one that pointed to a deliberate act of violence. Yet the pattern was incomplete, and Miss Marple knew that the truth lay in the manor's hidden corners, in the secrets guarded by its locked doors and wary inhabitants. The household moved with a strained decorum, the servants' footsteps soft as they navigated their duties under the pall of tragedy. Miss Marple descended to the morning room, where a frugal breakfast of tea, porridge, and dry toast awaited, a far cry from the festive feasts of days past. Sir Reginald Thornton was present, his face etched with exhaustion, his hands unsteady. As he stirred his tea, his grief, so publicly displayed, struck Miss Marple as increasingly theatrical, a performance that faltered in unguarded moments. Evelyn Marsh, pale and withdrawn, sat with her eyes fixed on her untouched plate, her fingers shredding a napkin. Clara Winthrop, her sharp features accentuated by her black dress, sipped her tea with a calculated calm, her gaze flicking about the room like a predator seeking weakness. Leonard Price, his polished exterior intact, read a letter with apparent absorption, though his eyes darted to Sir Reginald with a frequency that Miss Marple noted. Dr. Ernest Haydock, his medical bag at his side, was subdued, his usual brisk dulled by a preoccupation that suggested inner conflict. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the clink of spoons and the wind's mournful wail. Miss Marple, settling into her chair with her customary unobtrusive grace, offered a gentle remark to ease the tension. "Such a trying time for us all," she said, her voice soft but clear. "I do wonder how long this snow will keep us so confined." The comment was innocuous, yet it elicited a ripple of response, a tightening of Sir Reginald's lips, a fleeting smirk from Clara, a glance from Leonard. Dr. Haydock merely nodded, his fingers tightening on his bag. Clara, ever eager to stir the pot, set down her cup with a delicate clink. "Confinement breeds discontent," she said, her tone laced with a theatrical sigh. Poor Beatrice would have loathed this gloom. She was always so lively, flitting about with her charities. Her words carried a sting, and Evelyn's head snapped up, her eyes blazing. "Don't talk about her like that," Evelyn cried, her voice trembling. Beatrice wasn't just some frivolous girl. She cared about people. Her outburst ended in a choked sob, and she pressed her napkin to her face, her shoulders shaking. Sir Reginald's face darkened, but he remained silent, his fingers clenching his spoon. Leonard lowered his letter, his expression unreadable, while Dr. Haydock cleared his throat, his tone soothing. "Let's not upset ourselves," he said, his eyes on Evelyn. "Grief is hard enough without harsh words." Clara sniffed, unrepentant, but subsided, her gaze lingering on Sir Reginald with a malicious glint. Miss Marple, her knitting needles clicking softly, turned to Evelyn with a gentle smile. "You're quite right, my dear," she said. Lady Beatrice's kindness was evident. Did she ever mention feeling uneasy about her responsibilities? Managing such wealth must have been a burden. Evelyn hesitated, her eyes flicking to Sir Reginald, who was staring into his tea. She did worry, she admitted, her voice barely audible. She said money made people act strangely. She didn't like how it changed things. Her words were halting, as though she feared their weight, and Miss Marple nodded, her smile serene but her mind alight with the confirmation that Beatrice's wealth had been a source of tension, perhaps even danger. The meal concluded, and the guests dispersed, their movements heavy with the strain of enforced proximity. Miss Marple, her knitting bag in hand, resolved to explore the manor further, sensing that physical clues might illuminate the motives she had uncovered. She made her way to the upper floors, her steps soft on the thick carpets, her air one of an elderly lady taking a leisurely stroll. Her destination was the library, where Beatrice had supposedly gone on the night of her death. A pretext that Miss Marple suspected was a lie. The library was a cavernous room, its oak shelves lined with volumes that gleamed in the dim light of a single lamp. The air was heavy with the scent of leather and dust, and Miss Marple moved to the table where she had previously noted an open book of poetry. The book was still there, its ribbon marking a page, but she examined it more closely, noting the absence of fingerprints or creases that would suggest recent handling. The pages were pristine, the ribbon neatly placed, as though staged to support Sir Reginald's claim that Beatrice had gone for a book. Miss Marple's lips curved in a faint smile. The library, she concluded, had not been Beatrice's true destination. As she turned to leave, her eye caught a scrap of paper tucked beneath the book, its edge barely visible. She lifted the volume carefully and retrieved the scrap, her heart quickening as she saw Beatrice's elegant handwriting. The single word, scrawled in haste, was "Beware." Miss Marple's breath caught, her mind racing with the implications. A warning written by a woman who feared for her safety, but beware of whom? She slipped the scrap into her pocket, her movements discreet, and continued her exploration. Her senses heightened. Her next stop was the corridor leading to Sir Reginald, and Beatrice's private study, a heavy oak door that stood locked, as she had discovered the previous day. She paused, her fingers brushing the handle, and tested it again, finding it still secure. The lock was modern, its keyhole gleaming, and Miss Marple recalled Sir Reginald's explanation that Beatrice had kept it locked for privacy. The claim struck her as odd, given the couple's shared life, and she wondered what the study concealed: documents, perhaps, or evidence of a more personal nature. As she lingered, she heard footsteps approaching and stepped back, her air one of innocent confusion. Sir Reginald appeared, his face pale and his eyes startled at the sight of her. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice strained. "Are you lost? These corridors can be a maze." His smile was forced, and Miss Marple noted the way his hand hovered near the study door, as though guarding it. "Not lost, dear Sir Reginald," she said, her tone warm. "Merely admiring the house. Such a fine study door, so sturdy, lady." Beatrice valued her privacy, I understand. The question was asked with such mildness that it seemed almost incidental, yet Sir Reginald's smile faltered, his fingers twitching. "She did," he said, his voice tight. "Always fussing about her papers, her little projects. I left it to her." His correction was swift, But Miss Marple caught the tremor in his voice, the way his eyes avoided hers. She thanked him and moved on, her mind noting his unease, his proprietary stance by the door. The study, she was certain, held secrets, and she resolved to find a way inside. Later, she sought out Dr. Haydock, finding him in the conservatory, where he was examining a wilted fern with an air of distraction. "Dr. Haydock," she said, settling onto a bench with her knitting, "you've been so steadfast in this dreadful time. Tell me, was Lady Beatrice ever troubled by her health? Nervousness, perhaps?" The question was gentle, yet probing, and Dr. Haydock's hands stilled, his eyes meeting hers with a flicker of wariness. "She was healthy enough," he said, his tone cautious. "A bit anxious these last weeks, but nothing serious." She asked, "About sedatives once, for sleeplessness, but I advised against them." She seemed content with that. His words were measured, yet Miss Marple sensed a reticence, a reluctance to say more. She pressed gently, her smile disarming. "Sedatives," she said, her needles clicking steadily. "How prudent of you to caution her. Were they kept in your bag, I suppose? Such things can be dangerous if misplaced." The question was a delicate probe, and Dr. Haydock's jaw tightened, his fingers brushing his bag. "They're secure," he said, his voice firm. "I keep a close eye on my supplies. No one's touched them." His defensiveness was subtle, but Miss Marple noted it, her mind turning to the possibility that a sedative might have played a role in Beatrice's fall. She thanked him and withdrew, her thoughts racing with the new thread. That afternoon, she joined Clara in the drawing room, where the widow was embroidering with a vigour that suggested suppressed energy. "Mrs. Winthrop," Miss Marple said, her tone conversational, "you have such a keen eye for the household. Did you ever notice Lady Beatrice working in her study? She must have been quite organized, with all her charities." The question was a gentle lure, and Clara's needle paused, her eyes gleaming with the prospect of gossip. "Organized," Clara said, her tone laced with scorn. "She was a dreamer, always scribbling notes and letters. She'd lock herself in that study for hours, as if Reginald couldn't be trusted with her plans. I heard them argue about it. Once she said he'd never understand her work." Her words were a revelation, and Miss Marple's needles slowed, her mind fitting the piece into the pattern. "Argue," she prompted, her voice soft. "How distressing was it about her charities, do you think?" Clara shrugged, her lips pursing. "Charities, money, who knows?" She said, "Reginald wanted control, and Beatrice wouldn't give it. She was stubborn, for all her softness." The admission was a spark, and Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her thoughts turning to the study's locked door, the warning. Note, the sedative. Beatrice's fear, her defiance, her wealth, these were the ingredients of a deadly brew, and Sir Reginald, with his financial desperation, was the most likely brewer. As evening fell, Miss Marple lingered in the corridor. Near the study, her air one of an elderly lady lost in thought. The house was quiet, the guests retired to their rooms, and she tested the door again, her fingers brushing the lock. It was a risk, but her curiosity was a flame that would not be quenched. She withdrew a hairpin from her bonnetrick learned, from her nephew's tales of detection, and worked it into the lock, her movements slow but steady. The mechanism yielded with a soft click, and she slipped inside. Closing the door behind her, the study was a small, orderly room, its desks strewn with papers and a single lamp casting a warm glow. Miss Marple moved to the desk, her eyes scanning. The documents, letters to charities, a draft of a will, a note from Beatrice's solicitor confirming her intent to revise her estate. The will, she noted, named a children's hospital as the primary beneficiary, with only a modest allowance for Sir Reginald. The discovery was a thunderbolt, confirming Beatrice's defiance and Sir Reginald's motive. She searched further, her fingers brushing a small drawer, and found a vial of sedative. Its label matching Dr. Haydock's prescription, but its contents half empty. Miss Marple's heart quickened, her mind racing with the implications. A sedative, stolen or misused, could have dulled Beatrice's senses, ensuring her fall. She replaced the vial and papers, her movements precise, and slipped out, relocking the door with care. The manor was still, but her thoughts were a storm, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place. The locked door, the warning note, the sedative all pointed to a plan. One that Sir Reginald, with his trembling hands and evasive eyes, was almost certainly behind. She returned to her room. Her knitting resumed, her needles clicking with the steady rhythm of one who knew that the truth, like the snow, was piling up, waiting for the moment to break. The storm outside raged on, but within Miss Marple a quiet certainty grew. The locked door had opened a window to the killer's mind, and she would not rest until the full design was revealed. Chapter 7. The Cousins Secret the Snow. An unyielding warden held Havford Manor in its icy grasp, its relentless fall sealing the estate from the world beyond. The 5th day since Lady Beatrice's death dawned with a sky so heavy it seemed to press against the windows, mirroring the oppressive atmosphere within. Miss Jane Marple, ever wakeful despite the hour, sat by her bedroom window, her knitting needles still as she contemplated the bleak expanse of white. Her mind, sharp as the frost outside, wove through the evidence she had gathered: the nail at the top of the stairs, the scratch on Beatrice's wrist, the bruising, the sedative vial, the warning note, and the financial motive that pointed to Sir Reginald Thornton. Yet the pattern, though clear, lacked the final threads to bind it, and Miss Marple knew that the key lay in the emotions and secrets of those closest to the victim, particularly Evelyn Marsh, Beatrice's fragile cousin. The household stirred. With a weary resignation, the servants' movements hushed as they navigated the rituals of a home in mourning. Miss Marple descended to the morning room, where a modest breakfast of tea, scones, and butter awaited. The festive abundance of earlier days a distant memory. Sir Reginald was absent, his absence noted by the empty chair at the head of the table, a void that seemed to amplify the tension. Evelyn sat huddled in her seat, her face pale and her eyes shadowed, her fingers shredding a piece of scone into crumbs. Clara Winthrop, her black dress as sharp as her tongue, sipped her tea with a primness that belied her restless gaze, ever seeking fodder for gossip. Leonard Price, his polished demeanour intact, read a newspaper with feigned absorption, though his eyes flicked to the door with a frequency that Miss Marple found telling. Dr. Ernest Haydock, his medical bag at his side, was subdued, his usual efficiency tempered by a distraction that suggested he wrestled with unspoken doubts. The silence was thick, broken only by the clink of china and the wind's relentless moan. Miss Marple, settling into her chair with her customary unobtrusive grace, offered a gentle remark to ease the strain. "Such a melancholy morning," she said, her voice soft but clear. "I do hope we find some comfort in each other's company. Despite our sorrow." The comment was gentle, yet it elicited a ripple of response, a flinch from Evelyn, a smirk from Clara, a glance from Leonard. Dr. Haydock merely nodded, his fingers tightening on his bag. Clara, never one to let silence linger, set down her cup with a delicate clink. "Comfort's hard to come by in a house like this," she said, her tone laced with a theatrical sigh. Poor Beatrice would have tried to cheer us, no doubt, with one of her endless charities. Such a waste, all that money. Her words carried a familiar sting, and Evelyn's head snapped up, her eyes blazing with a rare fire. "Stop it," Evelyn cried, her voice trembling but fierce. Beatrice's charities weren't a waste. She cared about people, not like some. Her outburst ended in a gasp, and she pressed her hands to her mouth, her eyes wide with fear as though she had said too much. Clara's eyebrows arched, her lips curling in a way that suggested she relished the reaction. Leonard lowered his newspaper, his expression unreadable, while Dr. Haydock cleared his throat, his tone soothing. "Let's not distress ourselves," he said, his eyes on Evelyn. "We're all under strain." Clara sniffed, unrepentant, but subsided, her gaze lingering on Evelyn with a malicious glint. Miss Marple, her knitting needles clicking softly, turned to Evelyn with a gentle smile. "You're quite right, my dear," she said. "Lady Beatrice's kindness was her strength. Did she ever share her worries with you? Close cousins often confide in each other." Evelyn hesitated, her eyes darting to the door as though expecting Sir Reginald to appear. She did, sometimes," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "but she didn't like to burden me. She was always protecting me." Her words were halting, and Miss Marple nodded, her smile serene but her mind alert to the hint of withheld truth. The meal concluded, and the guests dispersed, their movements heavy with the weight of confinement. Miss Marple, her knitting bag in hand, resolved to draw Evelyn out further, sensing that her fear held the key to Beatrice's final days. She found Evelyn later in the conservatory, a glass-walled room where the snow's glare cast a cold light. On the wilting ferns, Evelyn stood by a window, her shawl drawn tightly about her, her breath fogging the pain. Miss Marple approached, her steps soft, and offered a warm smile. "My dear, you look chilled," she said, settling onto a wicker bench with her knitting. "Come, sit with me. It's warmer here, and a little company does wonders for the heart." Her tone was so kind, so maternal, that Evelyn hesitated only a moment before joining her, her hands clutching her shawl. Miss Marple's needles clicked, steadily, their rhythm a soothing counterpoint to the silence. "You and Beatrice were very close, weren't you?" she said, her voice gentle. "It must be so hard, losing her so suddenly." Did she ever speak of what troubled her these last weeks? The question was asked with such mildness that it seemed almost incidental, yet Evelyn's fingers tightened on her shawl, her eyes filling with tears. "She was my only family," Evelyn whispered, her voice trembling. "After my parents died, Beatrice took me in. She was so kind, but she wasn't herself lately. She was afraid, Miss Marple. She wouldn't say why, not exactly, but I could see it in her eyes." Her words were a confession, and Miss Marple patted her hand, her touch soothing but her eyes sharp, afraid. She prompted, her tone one of gentle concern. How dreadful. Did she ever mention anyone in particular? Someone who made her feel unsafe? Evelyn bit her lip, her gaze darting to the door. "She didn't name anyone," she said, her voice barely audible, "but she talked about Reginald sometimes. She said he had a temper, that he wasn't the man she thought she'd married." The admission was a thunderbolt, and Miss Marple's needles slowed, her mind fitting the piece into the pattern. "A temper," she said, her voice soft but probing. "How distressing. Did she fear him, do you think?" Evelyn's eyes widened, and she nodded, a single, jerky motion. "Yes," she whispered. She didn't say it outright, but I could tell. Last week, she told me she was going to change her will. She wanted to leave her money to a charity, not Reginald. She said it was the only way to be free. Her voice broke, and she burst into tears, her hands covering her face. Miss Marple's heart quickened, but her expression remained calm, her hand resting lightly on Evelyn's shoulder. There, my dear," she said, her voice soothing. "You've been so brave, sharing this. It must have been so hard for Beatrice, carrying such a burden." She handed Evelyn a handkerchief, her mind racing with the revelation. Intent to change her will, to deny Sir Reginald her fortune, was a motive so potent it could drive a desperate man to murder. The sedative vial, the warning note, the staged fall-all pointed to a plan. One that Sir Reginald, with his trembling hands and evasive eyes, was almost certainly behind. Evelyn dried her eyes, her breathing unsteady. "I shouldn't have said anything," she whispered. "Reginald. He'll be so angry if he knows." Her fear was palpable, and Miss Marple patted her hand, her smile reassuring. "You've done nothing wrong," she said. "Grief makes us speak, and it's only natural. Why don't you rest now? I'll sit with you, if you like." Evelyn shook her head, murmuring in excuse, and fled the conservatory, her shawl trailing behind her. Miss Marple watched her go, her mind turning to the implications of Evelyn's confession. The will, the fear, the temper, these were the sparks that had ignited the tragedy, and she needed only a final piece to confirm her suspicions. She rose and made her way to the drawing-room, where she found Clara Winthrop embroidering with a vigour that suggested suppressed excitement. "Mrs. Winthrop," Miss Marple said, settling into a chair with her knitting, "you have such a keen eye for the household. Did you ever notice Lady Beatrice seeming anxious about her husband? Close couples often have their tensions, don't they?" The question was a gentle lure, and Clara's needle paused, her eyes gleaming with the prospect of gossip. "Anxious," Clara said, her tone laced with scorn. "She was terrified, if you ask me. Reginald's all charm in public, but I've heard him shout when he thought no one was listening. Beatrice would go pale, like a mouse cornered by a cat. I told her she should stand up to him, but she was too soft." Her words were a revelation, and Miss Marple's needle slowed, her mind noting the confirmation of Evelyn's fears. "How distressing," she said, her voice soft. "Did she ever mention her plans, perhaps about her money?" Clara's lips pursed, her eyes narrowing as though weighing the value of her information. "She hinted once," Clara admitted, leaning forward. "Said she was tired of being controlled. I thought she meant Reginald's spending, but now, well, who knows?" Her tone was coy, but Miss Marple sensed a truth beneath the theatrics. She thanked Clara and withdrew, her thoughts turning to the study where the sedative vial and draft will had revealed Sir Reginald's motive. The scratch on Beatrice's wrist, she suspected, might be the key to proving his guilt, mark made in a struggle, perhaps by a cufflink or watch later. She sought out Dr. Haydock, finding him in the library, where he was sorting through medical journals with an air of distraction. "Dr. Haydock," she said, her tone one of polite deference, "you've been so diligent in this awful time. Tell me, did you ever notice any marks on Lady Beatrice, perhaps from jewellery? Such things can catch the skin, can't they?" The question was a delicate probe, and Dr. Haydock's hands stilled, his eyes meeting hers with a flicker of surprise. "Marks," he said, his voice cautious. "There was a scratch on her wrist, as you saw. It could have been anything, a bracelet, a nail. Falls are unpredictable." His explanation was plausible, yet Miss Marple sensed a reluctance, a desire to close the matter. She pressed gently, her smile disarming. "Of course," she said, "though a scratch from a cufflink, say, might be quite distinctive. Men's jewelry can be so sharp." Dr. Haydock's jaw tightened, but he nodded, his fingers brushing his bag. "I suppose so," he said, his tone final. "But I saw nothing like that." His defensiveness was subtle, but Miss Marple noted it, her mind turning to Sir Reginald's cuffs, which she had observed at breakfast. One had been missing a link, a detail that now seemed significant. She returned to her room, her knitting, resumed her needles clicking with the steady rhythm of one who knew that the truth was near. Evelyn's secret, the will, the fear. The temper had tightened the noose around Sir Reginald, and the scratch, with its fleck of metal, was the final thread. The snow continued to fall, trapping the household in its icy embrace, but within Miss Marple, a quiet certainty grew. The cousin's secret had opened a door to the killer's heart, and she would not rest until the full design was revealed. Chapter 8. The study revealed the snow, an unrelenting captor, continued its siege on Havford Manor, piling against the windows in drifts that obscured the world beyond and deepened the sense of isolation within. The 6th day since Lady Beatrice's death dawned with a sky so heavy it seemed to crush the spirit, its grey pallor a mirror to the mounting suspicions that simmered among the trapped guests. Miss Jane Marple, rising with her customary punctuality, sat by her bedroom window, her knitting needles idle as she contemplated the frozen landscape, her mind as sharp as the icicles that fringed the eaves. Wove through the evidence, she had meticulously gathered the nail at the top of the stairs, the scratch on Beatrice's wrist with its embedded fleck of metal, the bruising on her arms, the warning note scrawled with "Beware," the sedative vial, and Evelyn's revelation about Beatrice's plan to redirect her fortune to charity. These threads formed a damning tapestry, pointing to Sir Reginald Thornton as the architect of a murder disguised as an accident. Yet Miss Marple knew that to unravel his deception, she must venture deeper into the Manor's secrets, and the locked study, with its hidden truths, beckoned like a siren. The household moved with a strained formality, the servants' faces etched with fatigue as they upheld the rituals of a home in mourning. Miss Marple descended to the morning room, where a sparse breakfast of tea, toast, and a single dish of preserves awaited the festive opulence of earlier days, replaced by austerity. Sir Reginald was present, his face gaunt and his eyes shadowed, his fingers toying with a teaspoon in a manner that suggested nervous energy rather than grief. Evelyn Marsh, her fragility more pronounced, sat with her hands clasped tightly, her gaze fixed on the table as though to avoid the world. Clara Winthrop, her black dress a stark frame for her sharp features, sipped her tea with a composure that bordered on eagerness, her eyes darting about the room in search of drama. Leonard Price, his polished exterior unruffled, read a letter, with feigned concentration, though his fingers betrayed a restless twitch. Dr. Ernest Haydock, his medical bag at his feet, was subdued, his usual briskness dulled by a preoccupation that Miss Marple found increasingly significant. The silence was heavy, broken only by the clink of china and the wind's mournful wail. Miss Marple, settling into her chair with her unobtrusive grace, offered a gentle remark to ease the tension. "Such a trying time for us all," she said, her voice soft but clear. "I do hope the snow will relent soon, if only to bring us news from the village." The comment was innocuous, yet it prompted a flicker of responsive flinch from Evelyn, a faint smirk from Clara, a glance from Leonard. Sir Reginald's teaspoon stilled, his eyes narrowing briefly before he resumed. His fidgeting dot Clara, ever eager to stir the pot, set down her cup with a delicate clink. News would be a relief, she said, her tone laced with a theatrical sigh. This house feels like a tomb, and poor Beatrice's shadow hangs over us all. She was so reckless, wasn't she? Always rushing about. No wonder she fell. Her words carried a familiar sting, and Evelyn's hands tightened, her knuckles white, though she remained silent, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Leonard lowered his letter, his voice smooth but edged. "Reckless or not, it's a tragedy," he said, his eyes on Sir Reginald. "Beatrice's loss leaves a void, especially for those who depended on her. Generosity." His words were calculated, and Miss Marple noted the way Sir Reginald's jaw tightened, his fingers clenching the teaspoon. Dr. Haydock cleared his throat, his tone conciliatory. "Let's not dwell on blame," he said, his eyes on Clara. "We're all shaken, and speculation helps no one." Clara sniffed, unrepentant, but subsided, her gaze lingering on Sir Reginald with a malicious glint. Miss Marple, her knitting needles clicking softly, turned to Sir Reginald with a gentle smile. "You must miss her terribly," she said. "Did Lady Beatrice often work late in her study? It must have been a comfort having such a private space." The question was asked with such mildness that it seemed almost incidental. Yet Sir Reginald's eyes flickered, his smile strained. "She did," he said, his voice gruff. "Always fussing over her papers, her charities. I left her to itch. She liked her privacy." His words were clipped, and Miss Marple noted the way his hand trembled, the teaspoon clattering against the saucer. The mention of the study, she sensed, had touched a nerve, and she filed the reaction away, her mind turning to the locked door and its secrets. The meal concluded, and the guests dispersed, their movements sluggish under the weight of confinement. Miss Marple, her knitting bag in hand, resolved to breach the study's defences. Sensing that its contents would confirm her suspicions, she spent the morning in the drawing-room, her knitting a pretext as she observed the household's dynamics. Evelyn remained withdrawn, her eyes red from crying, while Clara's barbed remarks drew no response. Leonard's polished demeanour seemed increasingly strained, his glances at Sir Reginald laced with a subtle challenge. Dr. Haydock, meanwhile, was preoccupied, his fingers often straying to his medical bag as though seeking reassurance. As afternoon faded into evening, Miss Marple seized her opportunity. The house was quiet, the guests retired to their rooms or scattered to the Manor's corners, and she made her way to the upper corridor, her steps soft on the thick carpets. The study door loomed before her, its oak surface unyielding, its lock a silent challenge. She paused, her senses alert, and withdrew a hairpin from her bun, a tool she had employed the previous day with surprising success. Her nephew's tales of detection had served her well, and she worked the hairpin into the lock with a steady hand, her movements slow but precise. The mechanism yielded with a soft click, and she slipped inside, closing the door behind her with care. The study was a small, orderly room, its air heavy with the scent of ink and leather. A single lamp cast a warm glow over a mahogany desk strewn with papers, a blotter, and a pen left askew, as though its owner had departed in haste. Miss Marple moved to the desk, her eyes scanning the documents with a precision honed by years of observation. There were letters to charities, their tone earnest and detailed, outlining Beatrice's plans to fund a children's hospital. A draft of a will, its pages marked by corrections, confirmed Evelyn's revelation Beatrice had intended to leave the bulk of her fortune to the hospital, with only a modest allowance for Sir Reginald. The solicitor's letter, pinned beneath a paperweight, verified her instructions, dated just days before her death. The discovery was a thunderbolt, cementing Sir Reginald's motiva. Fortune he could only claim through her death. Miss Marple's heart quickened as she searched further, her fingers brushing a small drawer at the desk's edge. She eased it open, revealing a half-empty vial of sedative, its label matching Dr. Haydock's prescription, but its contents diminished. The vial was a damning clue, suggesting that Beatrice had been drugged to ensure her fall, her senses dulled, to prevent resistance. Miss Marple examined it closely, noting a faint smudge on the glass, as though handled carelessly. She replaced it with care, her mind racing with the implications. The sedative, the will, the warning note all pointed to a plan, one that Sir Reginald, with his financial desperation and trembling hands, had executed with chilling precision. Her search was interrupted by a faint creak from the corridor, and she froze, her senses alert. She extinguished the lamp, plunging the room into darkness, and moved to the door, her ear pressed against the wood. The footsteps were soft, hesitant, and passed by, accompanied by the faint scent of tobacco. Miss Marple waited, her breath steady, until the silence returned. She relit the lamp and continued her examination, her fingers tracing the desk's surface for further clues. A small notebook, tucked beneath a pile of letters, caught her eye, its pages filled with Beatrice's elegant script. The entries were brief, a record of her daily thoughts, but one caught Miss Marple's attention. "I must act soon, before it's too late. He watches me always." The pronoun was ambiguous, but in the context of Evelyn's fears and Clara's gossip, it pointed to Sir Reginald. Miss Marple closed the notebook, her mind alight with the weight of her findings. The study had revealed not only Sir Reginald's motive, but the means of his crime. The sedative, likely administered in Beatrice's wine, had ensured her vulnerability, while the nail at the top of the stairs was a clumsy attempt to stage an accident. The scratch on Beatrice's wrist, with its fleck of metal, remained a puzzle, but Miss Marple suspected it was the mark of a struggle, perhaps caused by a cufflink or watch, a detail that could tie Sir Reginald to the act. She replaced everything as she had found it, her movements precise, and slipped out, relocking the door with her hairpin. The corridor was empty, but the air felt charged, as though the manor itself sensed the unravelling of its secrets. Miss Marple returned to her room, her knitting resumed, her needles clicking with a steady rhythm that belied the storm in her mind. The study had opened a window to the killer's intent, confirming Sir Reginald as the architect of Beatrice's death, but she needed one final piece proof that could not be dismissed as conjecture. As evening fell, she joined the guests in the drawing room, where a fire burned low, casting flickering shadows. Sir Reginald was present, his face pale and his hands unsteady, his conversation with Leonard marked by a forced joviality. Evelyn sat apart, her eyes fixed on her lap, while Clara's embroidery was a pretense, her needle jabbing with suppressed excitement. Dr. Haydock, his medical bag at his side, seemed distracted, his eyes often straying to Sir Reginald with a scrutiny that Miss Marple found intriguing. She engaged Clara in conversation, her tone one of innocent curiosity. "Mrs. Winthrop," she said, her needles clicking steadily, "you must have seen so much of the household's routines. Did Lady Beatrice ever seem preoccupied with her study? Such a private place, it must have been her sanctuary." The question was a gentle probe, and Clara's eyes gleamed, eager to share. "Sanctuary," Clara said, her tone laced with scorn. "More like a fortress. She'd lock herself in there for hours, scribbling away. Reginald hated it, said it was her way of shutting him out. I heard them argue about it once, him banging on the door, her telling him to leave her be. Her words were a spark, and Miss Marple's needles slowed, her mind noting the confirmation of the study's significance. How distressing, she said, her voice soft. Did she ever mention what she worked on? Clara shrugged, her lips pursing. Charities, probably, she said, or her precious will. She was always talking about doing good, as if Reginald didn't need the money more. The admission was a final thread, and Miss Marple thanked her, her thoughts turning to the scratch, the sedative, the will. The study had revealed the heart of the crime, but the scratch, with its fleck of metal, was the key to proving Sir Reginald's guilt, a mark that could only have come from a struggle. Perhaps with a cufflink he wore, the snow continued to fall, sealing the manor in its icy embrace. But within Miss Marple, a quiet certainty grew. The study's secrets had tightened the noose around Sir Reginald, and she needed only to find the matching cufflink or watch, a detail that would bind him to the crime. She sat by the fire, her needles clicking with the rhythm of one who knew that the truth, like the storm, was nearing its climax, waiting for the moment to break. Chapter 9. The Confrontation. The snow, though still a formidable barrier, showed faint signs of relenting on the 7th day since Lady Beatrice's death, its relentless fall softening to a sporadic flurry that hinted at the world beyond Havford, Manor's icy walls. The Manor itself, however, remained a crucible of tension, its grand halls and festive remnants now a stark stage for the unravelling of a deadly secret. Miss Jane Marple, rising with her usual punctuality, sat by her bedroom window, her knitting needles still as she gazed at the thawing landscape. Her mind, as sharp as the frost that lingered on the panes, sifted through the evidence she had, meticulously gathered the nail at the top of the stairs, the scratch on Beatrice's wrist with its embedded fleck of metal, the bruising on her arms, the warning note scrawled with beware, the sedative vial, the draft will, and Evelyn's revelation about Beatrice's fear of Sir Reginald Thornton. These threads formed a near-complete tapestry, pointing to Sir Reginald as the orchestrator of a murder disguised as an accident. Yet Miss Marple knew that to expose him she must act swiftly, using the household's strained dynamics to provoke a misstep. The confrontation, she sensed, was imminent, and she would wield her gentle probing like a scalpel to reveal the truth. The household stirred with a restless energy, the servants' movements less hushed as whispers of clearing roads reached their ears. Miss Marple descended to the morning room, where a modest breakfast of tea, scones, and a small bowl of fruit awaited, the austerity a reflection of the Manor's sombre mood. Sir Reginald Thornton sat at the head of the table, his face haggard, his eyes darting to the window as though the melting snow heralded an unwelcome reckoning. His hands, wrapped around a teacup, trembled slightly, a detail Miss Marple noted as betraying more than grief. Evelyn Marsh, her fragility now tinged with a quiet resolve, picked at a scone, her eyes occasionally meeting Miss Marple's with a flicker of trust. Clara Winthrop, her black dress as severe as her expression, sipped her tea with a calculated calm, her gaze sharp and predatory, ever seeking the next morsel of scandal. Leonard Price, his polished exterior fraying at the edges, toyed with a piece of fruit, his fingers betraying a restless agitation. Dr. Ernest Haydock, his medical bag at his side, was subdued, his usual briskness replaced by a wariness that suggested he sensed the gathering storm. The silence was taut, broken only by the clink of china and the faint drip of melting snow outside. Miss Marple, settling into her chair with her unobtrusive grace, broke the quiet with a gentle remark designed to stir the undercurrents. "How heartening to see the snow easing," she said, her voice soft but clear. "It feels as though the truth, like the roads, may soon be uncovered." The comment was delicate, yet it landed like a pebble in a still pond, sending ripples through the group of flinch from Sir Reginald, a smirk from Clara, a glance from Leonard. Evelyn's hands tightened on her napkin, while Dr. Haydock's eyes narrowed, his fingers brushing his bag. Clara, ever eager to fan the flames, set down her cup with a deliberate clink. "Truth, Miss Marple," she said, her tone laced with a theatrical lilt. "That's a grand word for a simple accident. Poor Beatrice tripped, and no amount of prying will change that." Her words were sharp, but her eyes gleamed with anticipation, as though she hoped to provoke a reaction. Evelyn's face flushed, but she remained silent, her gaze fixed on her plate. Leonard, his voice smooth but edged, lowered his fruit knife. "Accidents can be deceptive," he said, his eyes on Sir Reginald. "Sometimes what looks simple hides a deeper intent. Beatrice's death has left questions, hasn't it?" His words were calculated, and Miss Marple noted the way Sir Reginald's teacup rattled against its saucer. His face paling, Dr. Haydock cleared his throat, his tone conciliatory. "Let's not stir unnecessary doubts," he said, his eyes on Leonard. "The facts are clear. Enough a fall, a broken neck. The coroner will confirm it when he arrives." His words were firm, yet Miss Marple sensed a flicker of unease, as though he doubted his own assertion. She seized the moment, her knitting needles clicking softly as she leaned forward, her smile serene but her eyes piercing. "Indeed, Dr. Haydock," she said, her voice gentle, "but facts can be curious things. For instance, the sedative in Lady Beatrice's system, might it have made her unsteady? Such things can alter a fall, can't they?" The question was a delicate probe, delivered with such mildness that it seemed almost incidental. Yet it struck like a spark in dry tinder. Sir Reginald's teacup slipped from his hand, shattering on the table, the porcelain fragments scattering like his composure. "Sedative," he stammered, his voice hoarse. "What nonsense! Beatrice took no such thing." His denial was vehement, but his eyes darted to Dr. Haydock, who stiffened, his face a mask of surprise. Evelyn gasped, her hands flying to her mouth, while Clara's smirk widened, her needle pausing in mid-stitch. Leonard's eyes narrowed, his fingers stilling on his knife. Miss Marple continued, her tone unchanged. "Oh, I may be mistaken," she said, her needles clicking steadily. "But I thought I saw a vial in the study, half empty, quite like the ones you use, Dr. Haydock. And then there's the scratch on Lady Beatrice's wrists, such a curious mark, almost as if made by a clink. Men's jewelry can be so sharp, don't you think?" Her words were a net cast with precision, and the room fell silent, the air charged with anticipation. Sir Reginald stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "This is absurd," he barked, his voice cracking. "You're spinning tales, Miss Marple, and I won't have it. Beatrice fell, and that's the end of it." His face was flushed, his hands clenched, and Miss Marple noted the way he touched his sleeve, where she had previously observed a missing cufflink. The gesture was instinctive, a telltale sign, and she pressed further, her smile unwavering. "Of course, Sir Reginald," she said, her voice soft, "but the study's such a private place. I couldn't help but wonder about the papers there." The ones about Lady Beatrice's will. She meant to change it, didn't she? To give her fortune to charity, not to you. The accusation was veiled in her gentle tone, yet it landed like a blow. Evelyn's gasp was audible, her eyes wide with fear, while Clara's smirk vanished, replaced by a look of shock. Leonard leaned forward, his eyes locked on Sir Reginald, while Dr. Haydock's knuckles whitened around his bag. Sir Reginald's face drained of colour, his hands trembling. "How dare you?" he sputtered, but his voice lacked conviction, his eyes darting to the door as though seeking escape. "You've no right to poke into our affairs. The study is private, and you're just a meddling old woman." His outburst was desperate, and Miss Marple remained serene, her needles clicking with a rhythm that seemed to mock his panic. "I only seek the truth," she said, her tone calm but firm. "Lady Beatrice was afraid, wasn't she?" she wrote. "Beware in her last days." And she spoke of changing her will. The sedative, the scratch, the nail at the top of the stairs. These are not the marks of an accident, but of a plan. And the cufflink Sir Reginald wear is the one missing. "From your sleeve." Her words were a crescendo, each one tightening the noose, and the room held its breath. Sir Reginald's hand flew to his sleeve, his fingers brushing the empty cuff, and his face crumpled, a mixture of fear and fury. "You're mad," he shouted, but his voice broke, and he staggered back, his chair toppling. Evelyn burst into tears, her hands covering her face, while Clara's needle fell to the floor, her composure shattered. Leonard's eyes gleamed with a cold intensity, as though he saw the endgame. While Dr. Haydock rose, his face pale but his voice steady. "Miss Marple," he said, his tone strained, "these are serious accusations. If you have evidence, it must be presented properly." His words were a plea for order, but Miss Marple met his gaze with a quiet certainty, her needles pausing. "I have no wish to cause distress," she said, her voice gentle, "but the truth will not stay buried. The vial in the study, the will, the scratch, these are facts, Dr. Haydock, and they point to a truth we cannot ignore." Her words were final, and the room fell silent, the weight of her accusations settling like the snow outside. Sir Reginald sank into his chair, his face ashen, his hands covering his eyes. "I loved her," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I didn't mean, it wasn't supposed to." His words trailed off, a confession teetering on the edge, but he stopped, his shoulders shaking. Miss Marple watched him, her expression one of quiet sorrow, knowing that the final admission would come. Driven by the pressure of her revelations, the guests dispersed, their movements unsteady, the air thick with unspoken questions. Evelyn fled to her room, her sobs echoing down the corridor, while Clara's face was a mask of shock, her usual malice silenced. Leonard lingered, his eyes on Sir Reginald, with a calculating glint, as though weighing his next move. Dr. Haydock approached. "Miss Marple," his voice low. "You've stirred a hornet's nest," he said, his tone a mix of admiration and concern. "I hope you know what you're doing." "I only seek justice," Miss Marple replied, her smile serene. "The truth has a way of emerging, Dr. Haydock, especially when it's been so carefully hidden." He nodded, his face troubled, and withdrew. His bag clutched tightly. Miss Marple returned to her room, her knitting resumed, her needles clicking with a steady rhythm that belied the storm she had unleashed. The confrontation had laid bare Sir Reginald's guilt, his missing cufflink a damning clue that matched the scratch on Beatrice's wrist. The sedative, the will, the warning note all pointed to a plan born of desperation, a fortune secured through murder. Yet she needed one final push, a moment when Sir Reginald's defences would crumble under the weight of his own deceit. As evening fell, she sat by the fire, her thoughts turning to the Manor's trapped inhabitants. Evelyn's fear, Clara's shock, Leonard's calculation, Dr. Haydock's Enazole were pieces in the puzzle. And Sir Reginald, with his trembling hands and missing cufflink, was the centre. The snow was thinning, the roads would soon clear, and with them the authorities would come. Miss Marple knew she must act before then, to ensure that justice, not the storm, had the final word. Her needles clicked on, a quiet anthem to her resolve, as she prepared for the final act in the tragedy of Havford Manor. Chapter 10. The unravelling. The snow, though waning, still clung to Havford Manor like a fading shroud, its drifts melting into slush that hinted at the world's slow reawakening. On the 8th day since Lady Beatrice's death, the Manor stood as a silent witness to the tensions that had boiled over in the previous day's confrontation. The air was charged with an uneasy anticipation, as if the house itself sensed the truth clawing its way to the surface. Miss Jane Marple, rising, with her customary precision, sat by her bedroom window, her knitting needles still as she gazed at the thawing landscape. Her mind, as keen as the morning frost, sifted through the evidence she had meticulously woven into a damning case against Sir Reginald Thornton, the nail at the top of the stairs, the scratch on Beatrice's wrist with its fleck of metal, the bruising on her arms, the warning note scrawled with beware, the sedative vial, the draft will, and Evelyn's revelation about Beatrice's fear and intent to redirect her fortune. The confrontation had exposed Sir Reginald's guilt, his missing cufflink a pivotal clue, but Miss Marple knew that to secure justice, she must solidify her case with unassailable proof before the authorities arrived. The unravelling of the murderer's facade was at hand, and she would guide it with the gentle precision of a needle threading a complex stitch. The household stirred with a nervous energy, the servants' movements quickening as rumours of passable roads filtered through the Manor. Miss Marple descended to the morning room, where a simple breakfast of tea, porridge, and toast awaited, the austerity a stark reminder of the tragedy's shadow. Sir Reginald Thornton sat at the head of the table, his face ashen, his eyes hollow, with a desperation that bordered on panic. His hands, once steady in their theatrical grief, now fidgeted incessantly, betraying a man on the brink. Evelyn Marsh, her fragility tempered by a newfound resolve, sipped her tea with a quiet determination, her glances at Miss Marple carrying a silent plea for justice. Clara Winthrop, her black dress a frame for her sharp features, ate with a mechanical precision, her usual malice subdued by the weight of the previous day's revelations. Leonard Price, his polished veneer cracking, toyed with a spoon, his eyes darting between Sir Reginald and the door, as though anticipating an escape or an opportunity. Dr. Ernest Haydock, his medical bag at his side, was taut with unease, his professional demeanour strained by a growing awareness of the truth. The silence was brittle, broken only by the clink of cutlery and the faint drip of melting snow outside. Miss Marple, settling into her chair with her unobtrusive grace, broke the quiet with a remark designed to probe the fault lines. "How heartening to see the snow clearing," she said, her voice soft but clear. "It feels as though clarity is coming, not just to the roads, but to our hearts." The comment was gentle, yet it landed like a spark in a powder keg, eliciting a flinch from Sir Reginald, a pursed lip from Clara, a tense glance from Leonard. Evelyn's hands tightened on her cup, while Dr. Haydock's fingers brushed his bag. His eyes narrowing. Clara, her composure fraying, set down her spoon with a sharp clink. "Clarity, Miss Marple," she said, her tone edged with unease. "You've stirred enough trouble with your talk of sedatives and cufflinks. Let's not make more of this than it is a sad accident." Her words lacked their usual venom, and Miss Marple noted the flicker of doubt in her eyes, a sign that even Clara's malice was shaken by the mounting evidence. Leonard, his voice smooth but strained, leaned forward. "Accidents can be questioned," he said, his eyes on Sir Reginald. "Beatrice's death has left gaps, financial ones. For some, those gaps raise doubts, don't they?" His words were a calculated jab, and Sir Reginald's face flushed, his hands clenching into fists. Dr. Haydock cleared his throat, his tone a plea for calm. "We mustn't speculate wildly," he said, his eyes on Leonard. "The coroner will settle matters when he arrives. Until then, let's keep peace." His words were measured, but Miss Marple sensed a crack in his certainty, a doubt that mirrored her own convictions. She seized the moment, her knitting needles clicking softly as she leaned forward, her smile serene but her eyes piercing. "Peace is a fine thing, Dr. Haydock," she said, her voice gentle, "but truth is finer still. I've been thinking about that sedative vial in the study. So curious, don't you think, that it was half empty? And the scratch on Lady Beatrice's wrist, with its tiny fleck of metal. It's almost as if someone struggled with her, someone wearing a cuff. Perhaps." Her words were a delicate net, cast with precision, and the room stilled, the air thick with tension. Sir Reginald's face drained of colour, his hands trembling violently. "You're obsessed," he snapped, his voice hoarse. "There was no struggle, no cufflink. Beatrice fell, and you're twisting it into something vile." His denial was desperate, but Miss Marple noted the way his hand strayed to his sleeve, where the missing cufflink had once been, a gesture that betrayed his fear. She continued, her tone unchanged. "Twisting, Sir Reginald. I only follow the facts. The study revealed so much. The will, naming a charity over you. The sedative likely slipped into her wine. The note warning, beware. And then there's the nail at the top of the stairs, so conveniently placed to snag her gown. These are not the marks of an accident, but of a plan." Her words were a crescendo, each one tightening the noose, and the guests froze, their eyes locked on Sir Reginald. Evelyn's cup clattered against its saucer, her voice a whisper. "You knew," she said, her eyes on Sir Reginald, wide with horror. "You knew she was going to change her will. She told me. She was afraid of you." Her words were a spark, and Sir Reginald's face contorted, his hands slamming on the table. "Enough," he roared, his voice breaking. "You're all against me. I loved her, I tell you. I'd never." His words faltered, and he sank back, his shoulders shaking. Clara's face was pale, her usual smirk gone, while Leonard's eyes gleamed with a cold satisfaction, as though he saw the end game. Dr. Haydock rose, his face troubled, his voice low. "Miss Marple," he said, "these are grave claims. If you have proof, it must be shared." His tone was a mix of caution and curiosity, and Miss Marple met his gaze with a quiet certainty, her needles pausing. "I have proof enough," she said, her voice calm. "But let me speak with you privately, Dr. Haydock. There's a matter I'd like your expertise on." Her request was polite, yet firm, and Dr. Haydock hesitated, then nodded, gesturing to the library. The guests watched in silence as they departed. the air heavy with unspoken questions. In the library, Miss Marple closed the door and turned to Dr. Haydock, her expression one of quiet resolve. "Doctor," she said, her voice low, "you've been honorable, but I believe you suspect more than you've said. The sedative vial in the study, was it yours?" The question was direct, yet cloaked in her gentle demeanor, and Dr. Haydock's face paled, his hands tightening on his bag. "It was," he admitted, his voice strained. "I noticed it missing from my bag the day after Beatrice's death. I didn't think, I assumed it was misplaced. But if it was used—" His words trailed off, and Miss Marple nodded, her eyes piercing. "It was used," she said. "Slipped into her wine, I suspect, to make her drowsy, to ensure her fall. The vial was in the study, with papers showing Beatrice's intent to cut Sir Reginald from her will. He had motive, means, and opportunity. Her words were a verdict." And Dr. Haydock's shoulders sagged, his face a mask of regret. "I should have checked my bag sooner," he said, his voice hollow. "If I'd known—" He stopped, and Miss Marple patted his arm, her touch reassuring. "You couldn't have known," she said, "but we can act now. The scratch on Beatrice's wrist, I believe it came from Sir Reginald's cufflink, the one missing from his sleeve. If we find it, or its match, it will seal the case." Dr. Haydock nodded, his resolve hardening, and agreed to help, his medical authority lending weight to her plan. Miss Marple then sought out Clara, finding her in the drawing room, her embroidery abandoned as she stared at the fire. "Mrs. Winthrop," Miss Marple said, settling into a chair with her knitting, "you've seen so much of this household's heart. Did you ever overhear Sir Reginald and Beatrice discuss her will? Such matters constrain a marriage, can't they?" The question was a gentle probe, and Clara's eyes widened, her composure fraying. "I did," she admitted, her voice low, "a few weeks ago, in the garden. He was furious, said she was ruining him by giving her money away. She stood her ground, said it was hers to decide. I thought it was just a spat, but now—" Her words were a confession, and Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking steadily, the confirmation tightening her case. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft. "You've helped more than you know." Clara looked away, her face troubled, and Miss Marple withdrew, her thoughts turning to the final piece, the cufflink. She returned to the staircase, her eyes scanning the steps for any overlooked clue. Near the base, caught in a crack in the marble, she found a tiny glint of metal, fragment of a cufflink, its design matching the one Sir Reginald wore. She retrieved it with care, wrapping it in her handkerchief, her heart quickening with the certainty of her find that as evening fell. Miss Marple gathered her evidence, the cufflink fragment, the sedative vial's description, the will's intent. The warning notes waited, prepared for the final push. She joined the guests in the drawing room, where Sir Reginald sat, his face a mask of defeat, his hands trembling. Evelyn was absent, resting in her room, while Clara's silence was a stark contrast to her usual chatter. Leonard watched Sir Reginald with a predatory gaze, and Dr. Haydock stood by the fire, his face resolute. Miss Marple spoke, her voice calm but firm. "The snow is clearing, and with it the truth," she said, her eyes on Sir Reginald. "The cufflink fragment found at the stairs matches your sleeve, Sir Reginald. The sedative, stolen from Dr. Haydock's bag, was in your study, with papers showing Beatrice's plan to deny you her fortune. She feared you, wrote beware, and you acted, drugging her wine, pushing her to her death. Her words were a verdict, and Sir Reginald's face crumpled, his hands covering his eyes. I didn't mean to kill her," he whispered, his voice breaking. I pushed her, in a moment of rage. She was going to ruin me, take everything. The nail was to make it look like an accident. His confession was a flood, and the room stilled, the weight of his guilt settling like the melting snow. Miss Marple's expression was one of quiet sorrow, her needles silent. The unravelling was complete, the murderer's mask stripped away. The snow continued to thaw, and with it the Manor's secrets, laid bare by the gentle persistence of a woman who saw truth in the smallest threads. Chapter 11. The Confession, the Snow, now a fading memory of its former ferocity, lay in patchy remnants around Havford Manor, its melt revealing the sodden earth beneath and signalling the world's tentative return. On the 9th day since Lady Beatrice's death, the manor stood as a hollow shell, its festive grandeur stripped by the weight of a truth that had shattered its inhabitants. Miss Jane Marple, rising with her customary diligence, sat by her bedroom window, her knitting needles idle as she gazed at the clearing landscape. Her mind, as precise as the ticking of a village clock, reviewed the evidence that had unravelled. Sir Reginald Thornton's guilty-nail at the top of the stairs, the scratch on Beatrice's wrist with its fleck of metal, the bruising on her arms, the warning note scrawled with beware, the sedative vial, the draft will, Evelyn's fears, and the damning cufflink fragment. The confrontation and subsequent unravelling had cornered Sir Reginald, his partial confession a crack in his facade, but Miss Marple knew that a full admission, laid bare before witnesses, was essential to secure justice. The confession, she sensed, was imminent, and she would orchestrate its delivery with the quiet authority of one who understood the fragility of human resolve. The household stirred with a jittery anticipation, the servants' movements brisk as news of an approaching constable filtered through the manor. The roads, though still treacherous, were passable, and the outside world was poised to intrude upon the manor's secrets. Miss Marple descended to the morning room, where a modest breakfast of tea, toast, and a small dish of preserves awaited. The austerity a silent testament to the tragedy's lingering shadow. Sir Reginald Thornton was absent, his absence a palpable void that heightened the tension. Evelyn Marsh, her fragility now laced with a steely resolve, sipped her tea with a steady hand, her eyes meeting Miss Marple's with a quiet gratitude. Clara Winthrop, her black dress as stark as her subdued demeanour, ate with a mechanical precision, her usual sharpness blunted by the weight of the truth. Leonard Price, his polished exterior fraying, toyed with a piece of toast, his gaze restless, as though weighing his place in the unfolding drama. Dr. Ernest Haydock, his medical bag at his side, was taut with purpose, his earlier doubts replaced by a commitment to see justice done. A shift Miss Marple had carefully nurtured. The silence was heavy, broken only by the clink of china and the distant crunch of boots on the thawing drive, signalling the constable's approach. Miss Marple, settling into her chair with her unobtrusive grace, broke the quiet with a remark designed to steady the group while probing their thoughts. "How comforting to know. Help is near," she said, her voice soft but clear. "The truth, like the snow, has a way of clearing when the time is right." The comment was gentle, yet it landed with precision, eliciting a nod from Evelyn, a pursed lip from Clara, a tense glance from Leonard. Dr. Haydock's fingers relaxed on his bag, his eyes meeting hers with a flicker of understanding. Clara, her composure strained, set down her cup with a faint clink. "Truth or not, it's been a grim business," she said, her tone lacking its usual venom. Poor Beatrice deserved better than this mess. Her words were a rare admission of sympathy, and Miss Marple noted the crack in her armor, a sign that even Clara's cynicism had been shaken by the revelations. Leonard, his voice low but edged, leaned forward. "It's not just Beatrice who suffered," he said, his eyes on the empty chair where Sir Reginald should have sat. "Actions have tainted us all. His greed, it's a heavy thing to witness." His words were a subtle accusation, and Miss Marple noted the way his fingers tightened on his napkin, as though he relished Sir Reginald's downfall. Dr. Haydock cleared his throat, his tone firm but measured. "We must let the law take its course," he said, his eyes on Leonard. "Speculation has done enough harm. The constable will handle things properly." His words were a call for order, but Miss Marple sensed his relief at the prospect of resolution, a sentiment she shared. But tempered with caution, she seized the moment, her knitting needles clicking softly as she leaned forward, her smile serene but her eyes piercing. "Indeed, Dr. Haydock," she said, her voice gentle, "the law will do its work, but it relies on truth. The evidency, sedative, the cufflink fragment, the will, the note all tells a story of calculation, not accident." Lady Beatrice's fear of her husband was no secret, was it, Miss Marsh? Her question was directed at Evelyn, a gentle prompt to draw out the final piece of the emotional puzzle. Evelyn's cup trembled in her hand, but she met Miss Marple's gaze with a quiet strength. "No," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. She was terrified of him. She told me he'd changed, that his temper scared her. She said she had to change her will to protect herself, to be free of him. Her words were a clarion, and the room stilled, the weight of her testimony settling like the last snowflake of a storm. Clara's face paled, her usual smirk absent, while Leonard's eyes gleamed with a cold satisfaction, as though he saw the noose tightening. Dr. Haydock's jaw tightened, his fingers brushing his bag, a gesture of resolve. Miss Marple nodded, her needles pausing as she turned her attention to the group. "Such fear," she said, her voice soft but firm, "and such a plan to escape it, only to be cut short by a push, a fall, a nail staged to deceive. The truth is clear, but it needs a voice. Sir Reginald must speak it, for Beatrice's sake." The door to the morning room opened, and Sir Reginald entered, his face a mask of exhaustion, his eyes hollow with the look of a man who knew his time was short. He hesitated, his gaze sweeping the room, and Miss Marple noted the way his hand strayed to his sleeve, where the missing cufflink had once been. He sat heavily, his hands clasped before him, and the silence grew oppressive, broken only by the crunch of footsteps outside, growing louder as the constable neared. Miss Marple rose, her presence commanding despite her diminutive frame, and addressed the group, her voice calm but resonant. "Sir Reginald," she said, her eyes locking onto his, "the snow has cleared, and with it, the veil over Lady Beatrice's death. The evidence is overwhelming. The sedative you took from Dr. Haydock's bag slipped into her wine to dull her senses. The cufflink fragment, matching the one missing from your sleeve, found where she fell. The will, showing her intent to deny you her fortune. The note, warning beware of the danger you posed. You pushed her, staged the nail to suggest an accident, and hoped the snow would bury your crime. But truth, like spring, cannot be stopped. Will you speak, or let the law draw it from you?" Her words were a verdict, delivered with the quiet authority of one who saw through deception to the heart of human frailty. Sir Reginald's face crumpled, his hands covering his eyes as a sob escaped him. "I didn't mean to kill her," he whispered, his voice raw with anguish. "I loved her, but she was going to ruin me, take everything. The debts, they were crushing me. I put the sedative in her wine, just to talk, to make her listen. But she wouldn't. She fought me, scratched at my cufflink. I pushed her. In a moment of rage, down the stairs. The nail I fixed it later, to make it look like she tripped. I thought the snow would hide it, that no one would question." His confession was a torrent, spilling forth as the room held its breath, the weight of his guilt filling the air. Evelyn's sob broke the silence, her hands covering her face, her body shaking with the pain of betrayal. Clara's face was ashen, her usual malice silenced by the raw truth. Leonard's eyes were cold, his lips twitching as though he savoured the fall of a rival. Dr. Haydock's shoulders sagged, his face a mixture of sorrow and relief, his role in the tragedy a stolen vial now, a footnote to Sir Reginald's crime. Miss Marple remained serene, her expression one of quiet sorrow, her needles silent as she watched the confession unfold. The door opened, and a burly constable entered, his face stern but professional, accompanied by a young sergeant. Dr. Haydock rose, his voice steady as he addressed the officer. "Constable, we have a confession," he said, gesturing to Sir Reginald. "Miss Marple has uncovered the truth of Lady Beatrice's death. Sir Reginald has admitted to her murder." His words were formal, but his eyes met Miss Marple with a nod of respect, a silent acknowledgement of her role. The constable approached Sir Reginald, who stood, his hands trembling but his face resigned. "Sir Reginald Thornton," the constable said, his voice firm, "you are under arrest for the murder of Lady Beatrice Thornton. You will come with us." Sir Reginald nodded, his shoulders slumped, and allowed himself to be led away, his footsteps heavy on the marble floor. The sergeant followed, carrying a small case for evidence, his young face marked by the gravity of the moment. Miss Marple watched them go, her heart heavy with the cost of truth. She turned to Evelyn, who was weeping softly, and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "My dear," she said, her voice warm, "you were brave, and Beatrice would be proud. Her truth is free now." Evelyn nodded, her tears falling, but her eyes held a spark of strength, a promise of healing. Clara rose, her face pale, and murmured in excuse, retreating to her room, her usual bravado shattered. Leonard lingered, his gaze on the door where Sir Reginald had disappeared, his expression unreadable but tinged with calculation, as though he saw new opportunities in the wreckage. Dr. Haydock approached Miss Marple, his voice low. "You've done a remarkable thing," he said, his tone a mix of admiration and regret. "I should have seen it sooner. The vial, the signs. I'll be more vigilant, I promise." "You acted with honor," Miss Marple replied, her smile gentle. "We all see clearly in hindsight, Doctor. What matters is what we do now." He nodded, his face resolute, and withdrew, his bag in hand, ready to assist the constable with any medical formalities. Miss Marple returned to her room, her knitting resumed, her needles clicking with a steady rhythm that belied the storm she had navigated. The confession had laid bare Sir Reginald's crime, a desperate act born of greed and fear, but it had also revealed the resilience of truth, even in the darkest corners. The snow was nearly gone, the roads open, and with them the Manors. Secrets exposed by the gentle persistence of a woman who saw justice in the smallest details. She sat by the fire, her thoughts turning to Beatrice, whose life, though cut short, had left a legacy of kindness that no crime could erase. The confession was complete, and with it the tragedy of Havford Manor found its resolution, a quiet triumph of truth over deception. Chapter 12. The aftermath. The snow, now a mere memory, had left Havford Manor exposed to the raw, sodden reality of a winter's end. Its melt revealing the muddy paths and barren trees that framed the estate. On the 10th day since Lady Beatrice's death, the manor stood as a sombre relic, its festive trappings dismantled, its halls echoing with the weight of a tragedy resolved but not forgotten. Miss Jane Marple, preparing to depart, stood by her bedroom window, her knitting needles still as she gazed at the clearing landscape, her mind as precise as the ticking of her village clock, reflected on the intricate tapestry she had unravelled the nail at the top of the stairs, the scratch on Beatrice's wrist with its fleck of metal, the bruising, the warning note, the sedative vial, the draft will, Evelyn's fears, the cufflink fragment, and Sir Reginald Thornton's confession. The truth had been laid bare, justice secured, yet Miss Marple felt no triumph, only a quiet satisfaction tempered by the sorrow of human frailty. The aftermath, she knew, was a time for healing and reflection, and she would leave the manor with the same gentle resolve that had guided her through its darkness. The household moved with a subdued purpose, the servants packing away the remnants of Christmas as they prepared for a return to routine. The roads, cleared by a diligent crew from St. Mary's Mead, bustled with the comings and goings of officials, their presence a stark contrast to the manor's recent isolation. Miss Marple descended to the drawing-room, where a modest tea of sandwiches and scones awaited, a gesture of hospitality from a staff eager to reclaim normalcy. Evelyn Marsh was present, her face pale but her eyes brighter, a sign of resilience budding beneath her grief. Clara Winthrop, her black dress exchanged for a sombre grey, sat with a cup of tea, her usual sharpness softened by a reflective silence. Leonard Price, his polished demeanour restored but tinged with wariness, stood by the window, his gaze fixed on the drive where a police cart had departed with Sir Reginald. Dr. Ernest Haydock, his medical bag packed away, joined them, his face marked by a quiet determination to move forward. Sir Reginald's absence was a void, yet it brought a strange relief, as though the manor could breathe again. The silence was gentle, broken by the clink of cups and the distant call of a groundskeeper. Miss Marple, settling into a chair with her unobtrusive grace, offered a remark to ease the lingering tension. "How peaceful it feels, with the roads open," she said, her voice soft but clear. "It's as though the manor is waking from a long, troubled dream." The comment was delicate, yet it resonated, eliciting a nod from Evelyn, a faint smile from Clara, a glance from Leonard. Dr. Haydock's shoulders relaxed, his eyes meeting hers with a quiet gratitude. Evelyn, her voice steady despite its softness, spoke first. "I can't thank you enough, Miss Marple," she said, her hands clasped tightly. "Beatrice, she'd be at peace, knowing the truth is out. I was so afraid, but you gave me courage." Her words were a tribute, and Miss Marple patted her hand, her smile warm but tinged with sorrow. "You were brave, my dear," she said. "Your love for Beatrice shone through, and that's what matters. She lives on in your strength." Evelyn's eyes glistened, but she nodded, a spark of determination kindling within her. Miss Marple noted the change, a young woman stepping out of her cousin's shadow, ready to forge her own path. Clara, her usual malice absent, set down her cup with a soft clink. "I misjudged you, Miss Marple," she said, her tone uncharacteristically subdued. "I thought you were just meddling, but you saw what I didn't want to see. Reginald's fall, it's shaken me. Her admission was a rare glimpse of vulnerability, and Miss Marple nodded, her knitting needles clicking softly as she resumed her work. "We all see through a glass darkly, Mrs. Winthrop," she said, her voice gentle. "What matters is that we learn and move forward with kinder eyes." Clara looked away, her face troubled, but Miss Marple sensed a shift, a softening that might temper her gossip in the days to come. Leonard, his voice smooth but cautious, turned from the window. "It's a grim lesson," he said, his eyes on the group. "Reginald's greed cost more than Beatrice's life. It cost him everything. I'll admit, I saw his struggles, but I never imagined this." His words were measured, yet Miss Marple noted the flicker of calculation in his gaze, as though he were already planning his next move in a world without Sir Reginald's influence. She made no comment, her needles clicking steadily, but filed the observation away, knowing that ambition, like greed, could cast long shadows. Dr. Haydock, his face resolute, spoke next. "I failed Beatrice," he said, his voice low but firm. "The vial. I should have noticed it missing sooner. I've learned a hard lesson, Miss Marple, and I'll carry it with me. I'll be more vigilant, for her sake." His words were a vow, and Miss Marple met his gaze with a gentle smile, her eyes warm with understanding. "You acted with integrity, Doctor," she said. "No one could have foreseen such a plan. What matters is your resolve now, and I trust it will guide you well." Dr. Haydock nodded, his face easing, a burden lifted by her words. Miss Marple noted his renewed purpose, a man determined to honour Beatrice's memory through his work. The tea concluded, and the guests dispersed, their movements lighter as though the truth had lifted a weight from their shoulders. Miss Marple lingered, her knitting bag in hand, and made her way to the library, where she wished to take a final look at the scene of Beatrice's last moments. The room was quiet, its shelves a testament to the life Beatrice had led. Books on charity, poetry, and history, their pages marked by her gentle hand. Miss Marple paused by the table where she had found the warning note, her fingers brushing the wood as she reflected on the fear that had driven Beatrice to write it. The note, now in the constable's possession, was a silent cry, answered by the truth Miss Marple had uncovered. As she stood there, Evelyn entered, her shawl drawn about her, her face calm but resolute. "I'm leaving tomorrow," she said, her voice steady. "I'm going to London to work with the children's hospital Beatrice loved. I want to carry on her work, to make sure her kindness lives on." Her words were a declaration, and Miss Marple smiled, her heart warmed by the young woman's strength. "That's a fine thing, my dear," she said, her voice soft. "Beatrice would be so proud. You'll find your way, and her spirit will guide you." Evelyn nodded, her eyes bright, with tears but also with hope, and Miss Marple patted her hand, knowing that Evelyn's journey was just beginning. The library door opened, and Dr. Haydock appeared, his face serious but composed. "The constable's report is complete," he said, his voice low. "Reginald's confession has been recorded, and the evidence, the vial, the cufflink, will seals the case. He'll face trial, but there's no doubt of the outcome." His words were a final chord, and Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of quiet satisfaction. "Thank you, Doctor," she said. "Justice is a heavy thing, but it's right. Beatrice can rest now." Dr. Haydock nodded, his face easing, and withdrew, leaving Miss Marple and Evelyn in the quiet library, a space now cleansed of its secrets. Miss Marple made her way to the staircase where Beatrice had fallen, her eyes tracing the steps that had been the stage for a murderer's plan. The nail, now removed by the constable, had left a faint scar in the wood, a reminder of the deception that had nearly succeeded. She paused, her hand on the banister, and reflected on the fragility of trust, the way greed could twist love into something deadly. The scratch on Beatrice's wrist, the cufflink fragment, the sedative all were markers of a crime born in desperation, but also of a truth that refused to be buried. As she prepared to depart, she encountered Clara in the hall, her face softer than Miss Marple had ever seen. "I'm going back to the village," Clara said, her voice low. "I've said too much, hurt too many, these past days. I'll try to be better, Miss Marple, you've shown me. There's more to see than scandal." Her words were a confession, and Miss Marple smiled, her touch light on Clara's arm. "You've a good heart, Mrs. Winthrop," she said. "Let it guide you, and you'll find your way." Clara nodded, her eyes glistening, and Miss Marple sensed a change, a chance for redemption in the widow's sharp soul. Leonard, too, was leaving, his bags packed and his manner brisk. He paused to nod at Miss Marple, his smile tight but civil. "You're a remarkable woman," he said, his voice low. "Reginald's fall, it changes things. I'll be in London, looking for new ventures. Life moves on, doesn't it?" His words were smooth, but Miss Marple noted the glint in his eyes, a man already plotting his next ascent. She nodded, her smile serene, but made no reply, knowing that Leonard's ambition would carry him far. For better or worse, Dr. Haydock offered to escort Miss Marple to the village, his car ready to navigate the muddy roads. As they drove through St. Mary's Mead, the familiar sights, the church spire, the cottages, the green brought a quiet comfort to her heart. The Manor's tragedy was behind her, but its lessons lingered, a reminder of the delicate balance between trust and truth. She thanked Dr. Haydock, her smile warm, and stepped into her cottage, where a fire awaited. Its crackle a welcome home. Miss Marple settled by the hearth, her knitting resumed, her needles clicking with the steady rhythm of a life rooted in observation and compassion. The case had been a grim journey, a Christmas marred by greed and loss, but it had also been a testament to the power of truth, uncovered by a woman who saw the world in its smallest details. As the dusk fell over St. Mary's Mead, she reflected on Beatrice, whose kindness had outlived her, and on Evelyn, who would carry that legacy forward. The aftermath was not an end, but a beginning, a quiet promise that even in the darkest winters, spring would come again. Her needles clicked on, a soft anthem to the resilience of justice, and Miss Marple, with her mild eyes and unyielding heart, turned her thoughts to the days ahead, ready for whatever truths they might bring.